Jonah Wade cocked the rifle level with the woman's chest before his boots even settled on the porch steps. 2 years he had fought to stay alive, believing this ranch was nothing but a grave of debts and dust, and now a stranger stood in his doorway like she owned the place. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice cracked from 2 years of grief and silence. The woman did not flinch. She did not raise her hands. She only looked at him with eyes that held no fear at all, only sorrow, and something that looked unmistakably like relief. "Jonah Wade," she said quietly. "You're late." Before we go any further into this story, if this is your first time here, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe and follow this channel and stay with me all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's step back into that Montana valley 2 years after Jonah Wade rode away from Millbrook Hollow, and every soul in that town had already buried him in their hearts. Jonah did not lower the rifle. His hands shook, but not from weakness. From 2 years of surviving on frozen creek water and jerked meat, from 2 years of telling himself that if he ever made it back to this valley, there would be nothing left to protect. No cattle, no barn, no home. Just a bank notice nailed to a splintered door, and the ghost of his father's failure waiting for him in the weeds. Instead, there was a woman on his porch wearing an apron dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, standing her ground like she'd been born there. "I said, get off my land," Jonah said, again softer this time, though the rifle did not waver. "I don't know who you are, but this ranch belongs to the Wade family, and I am the last one standing." "I know exactly whose ranch this is, Mr. Wade," the woman answered. "I've known it every day for the last 2 years." "Then you know you're trespassing." "I know I'm the reason there's a roof over that barn at all." She said it without heat, without pride, the way a person states the color of the sky. "You can shoot me if that's what you rode 2 years through the wilderness to come home and do. Or you can put that rifle down and let me pour you some coffee, because you look like a man who hasn't eaten a hot meal in longer than he'd care to admit." Jonah's jaw worked. His finger stayed on the trigger guard, not the trigger, and some old instinct in him, the one his father had beaten into him as a boy, told him a woman who wasn't afraid of a loaded rifle was either a fool or telling the truth. She did not look like a fool. "Who are you?" he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a demand. Grace Calloway. The name meant nothing to him. He searched his memory the way a man searches a burned-out house for something worth saving, and came up with ashes. "I don't know you." "No," Grace said. "I didn't expect you would." She turned then, not in fear, but as if the conversation required her hands to be busy, and walked back through the open door into the house that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. Jonah stood on the step with the rifle still raised at a doorway that was now empty, and he understood in the sick, hollow place under his ribs that he had just pointed a gun at the person who might be the only reason he had a home left to defend. He lowered the rifle. He did not lower his guard. Inside the kitchen smelled of coffee and baking bread, and for one disorienting moment, Jonah thought he had ridden into the wrong valley entirely, that 2 years of hunger and cold had finally broken something loose in his mind and sent him wandering into a stranger's life. But the scarred table by the window was his mother's table. The chip in the second floorboard was the one he'd put there at 9 years old, dragging a plow blade across it to spite his father. This was his house, and a stranger was standing in it, pouring coffee into his mother's chipped blue cup, like she'd poured 1,000 cups from that same pot before. "Sit down, Mr. Wade," Grace said. "You look about to fall down where you stand." "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." He didn't sit, but he didn't leave either. He watched her hands as she worked steady, sure, unhurried, the hands of someone who had done hard labor and knew the value of not wasting emotion. She set the cup in front of the chair across from her own, an invitation she didn't repeat, and went back to kneading a second batch of dough like his sudden armed appearance in his own kitchen was an ordinary Tuesday interruption. "You're going to have to explain yourself," Jonah said. "Every fence I passed coming in was standing straight. Every head of cattle I saw grazing was fat and healthy. That barn roof was new lumber. Somebody's been running this ranch, and it sure wasn't my father because the last letter I got before I disappeared told me the bank had already served notice." "The bank did serve notice," Grace said. 18 months ago. I paid it." "You paid my father's debt." "I paid your debt, Mr. Wade. Your father passed the winter before you disappeared. I'm sorry you're only hearing that from me and not from someone who loved you enough to write it down proper." The words landed on him like a physical blow, and for a moment the kitchen tilted sideways. His father dead. Not waiting for him in some rocking chair with a lecture prepared about wasted years and wasted chances, but dead and buried while Jonah was breaking ice for drinking water in a canyon 300 miles north. Not knowing, not able to know, not there. "How?" Jonah said. His voice had gone rough. His heart. In his sleep, the town doctor said, "Peaceful, if that means anything to you." Jonah set his hand flat on the table to steady himself. Grace did not rush to comfort him. She did not reach for his hand or murmur soft words the way some women might performing grief on his behalf. She simply kept kneading the dough, giving him the room a man needed to absorb a blow without an audience watching him do it, and somehow that restraint felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 2 years. "Why?" Jonah finally said. "Why would a woman I've never met pay off my father's debts and rebuild my fences and nurse my cattle through 2 winters? What's in it for you?" Grace's hands stilled on the dough. "You don't remember me," she said. "I told you that already, and I meant it plain. But you remember a winter 4 years back before you ever left for the trail. A young widow near Sutter's Creek about to lose the last acre her husband left her being auctioned off piece by piece in front of the whole town because she couldn't make good on a debt to Ezra Pruitt's store." Jonah's brow furrowed. Something stirred in the back of his memory, distant and half-formed, like a name spoken in another room. "A cowboy rode up in the middle of that auction," Grace continued, "and paid the full debt in cash before the auctioneer could bring the gavel down. He didn't give his name. He tipped his hat, told the widow that everyone deserved a chance to rebuild, and rode off before she could even say a proper thank you. That was you, Jonah Wade. I asked around town for a week trying to learn who you were. Nobody could tell me much, only that you were Wade's boy, and that you'd gone back out on the trail not 2 days later like it never happened." Jonah stared at her. He remembered the auction vaguely, the way a man remembers a small kindness that cost him little and asked for nothing. He remembered feeling sorry for a woman surrounded by a jeering crowd. He did not remember her face. He did not remember the shape of the debt or the exact sum he'd paid. It had been to him one decent act among 100 forgettable days on the trail. To her, it had apparently been the difference between ruin and survival. "That was you," Jonah said slowly. "That was me," Grace answered. "And when I heard 2 years back that Jonah Wade had ridden north and never come home, and that the bank was fixing to seize this ranch the same way Pruitt tried to seize mine, I sold what was left of my own land, packed what I owned into one wagon, and came here." "Why?" "Because somebody once told me everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. I intended to make sure you got yours whether you ever came back to claim it or not." The kitchen went quiet, except for the low crackle of the stove. Jonah looked at this woman, really looked at her for the first time since he'd nearly put a bullet through her on his own porch, and saw not the intruder he'd braced himself to fight, but a woman who had given away everything she had to protect a debt of kindness. Most men would have forgotten by supper the same day. 2 years, he said. "You've been out here alone for 2 years. Not entirely alone. Otis stayed on. Your father's old hand. He didn't have anywhere else to go, and I didn't have the first notion how to run cattle, so we taught each other. He knew the stock. I knew numbers and debts and how to read a contract close enough to catch when a man was trying to cheat me. Between the two of us, we made it work. And the town let a woman run a ranch alone, just like that." Grace's mouth tightened just slightly, the first crack Jonah had seen in her composure. "The town did a great many things," she said. "Let is not the word I'd choose." Before Jonah could ask what she meant by that, boots sounded on the porch steps outside, unhurried, familiar in their rhythm, and a voice Jonah hadn't heard in 2 years called through the open door. Miss Grace, I got the south fence mended, but that bay mare's favoring her left foreleg again, and I don't like the look of—" The voice stopped dead in the doorway. An old man stood there, weathered as saddle leather hat in his hand, staring at Jonah like he'd seen a dead man walk, which as far as the whole valley was concerned he had. "Lord above," Otis breathed. "Jonah Wade." "Otis." The old man's eyes went wet before he could stop them, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and gripped Jonah's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "We buried you 100 times over in this valley, boy. Every rider that came through with news from the north we asked after you, and every time it was the same. Nobody'd seen hide nor hair of Jonah Wade in months. We figured the mountains took you." "They tried," Jonah said. "Didn't take." "No," Otis said, looking him up and down, taking in the gauntness of him, the new scar along his jaw, the 2 years carved into his face like a knife had done the work. "No, I reckon they didn't." Jonah looked between the old ranch hand and the quiet woman who'd gone back to her dough, like the reunion happening 6 feet from her was none of her concern. Though Jonah didn't miss the way her eyes kept flicking toward him, careful, watchful, like she was still deciding whether the man she'd spent 2 years protecting a ranch for was going to turn out worth the cost. "I owe you both an explanation," Jonah said, "and an apology. I came up on this porch ready to run off whoever I found squatting in my father's house. I didn't figure on finding the reason I still have a house at all." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Wade," Grace said, not looking up from the dough. "I think I owe you a considerable more than you're willing to say." Jonah answered, and something in his voice made her hands go still again. Otis cleared his throat the way a man does when he senses a current running under a conversation that isn't his business to wade into. "I'll just go see to that mare," he said, and ducked back out the door with more haste than his age should have allowed. Alone again, the silence in the kitchen took on a different weight. "You said the town didn't exactly let you run this ranch," Jonah said. "What did you mean by that?" Grace wiped her hands on her apron, slow, deliberate, buying herself a moment before she answered. "I mean that a widow with no husband, no family name in this valley, and a size that half the town found more amusing than a woman's ranching skills, isn't handed respect. She has to take it piece by piece off men who'd rather see her fail so they can say they were right about her all along. Who? It doesn't matter. It matters to me." "It shouldn't," Grace said, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd walked in with a rifle raised. "You've been gone 2 years, Mr. Wade. You don't know this town anymore, and you certainly don't know me. I didn't do what I did so you'd come home and fight my battles for me. I did it because I pay my debts, spoken or not. Then I reckon I've got a debt of my own to pay. You don't owe me a thing. You kept my family's ranch alive while the whole valley thought I was dead in a ravine somewhere," Jonah said, his voice rising with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in 2 years. Not grief exactly, not gratitude exactly, something closer to the ground shifting under his boots. "You buried my father because I wasn't here to do it. You held off the bank that was circling this place like a buzzard, and you're telling me I don't owe you a thing. I'm telling you that gratitude and debt aren't the same coin, and I didn't ask you to spend either one on me." Jonah studied her, this woman, who had every reason to demand something from him, land money recognition, and was instead standing in his kitchen refusing to accept even his thanks with any grace. It unsettled him more than the rifle standoff had. "Fine," he said finally. "Then let me ask you plain instead of trying to pay you back. Why are you still here? The debt's settled near as I can tell. The ranch is standing. You could have sold off what you'd built and gone anywhere in this territory. Why stay?" For the first time, Grace looked uncertain, and Jonah watched her search for an answer the way a person searches for the truth underneath a story they've told themselves so many times. It started to feel like the truth. "Because this ranch needed somebody to believe it was worth saving," she said finally. "And so did I. I hadn't found anywhere else that made me feel that way in a long, long time." Before Jonah could answer that, a shout rose from outside Otis's voice, sharp with alarm. "Jonah, Miss Grace Ryder's coming up the north road, and it ain't friendly company." Grace's face changed instantly. the softness gone replaced by something hard, and braced a woman who had clearly weathered this particular storm before and knew exactly what shape it was going to take. "Silas Vance," she said more to herself than to Jonah. "Who's Silas Vance?" "The man who spent 2 years trying to convince the county you were dead, so he could buy this ranch out from under a widow and an old man for 1/10 of what it's worth," Grace said, already moving toward the door, untying her apron as she went, her spine straightening with every step like she was strapping on armor. "And unless I miss my guess, he's about to get the shock of his life." Jonah followed her out onto the porch, rifle still in hand, and saw 4 riders coming up the long dirt road toward the house, dust rising behind them in a low brown cloud. At the front rode a man in a fine black coat, entirely wrong for ranch country, a coat meant for banks and courtrooms, not cattle trails. And even from this distance, Jonah could read the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life expected to be told no, and meant it. "That's him," Grace said quietly, riding in like he already owns the ground he's standing on. "Does he have cause to think that?" "He's been telling the county judge for 8 months that he does. He's got papers or claims to. Forged most like. But forged papers backed by enough money have a way of looking real to men who don't want to look too close." Grace's jaw tightened. "He's been waiting for the day nobody could stop him anymore. I expect he heard about your horse coming in through town this morning and rode straight out here to see for himself whether the rumor was true." "Well," Jonah said, thumbing back the hammer of his rifle, not aimed at anyone yet, just a plain, quiet statement of intent. "Let's give him his answer." The riders drew rein at the edge of the yard, dust settling slow around them, and the man in the black coat sat his horse with the easy arrogance of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head and never once imagined it going any way but his own. "Well now," Silas Vance said, and his voice was smooth, practiced the voice of a man who sold ideas for a living. "I was told a ghost rode into Millbrook Hollow this morning. I confess I didn't believe it." "You believe it now," Jonah said. Silas's eyes moved over him, calculating the way a man appraises livestock at auction. Then his gaze slid past Jonah to Grace, standing a half-step behind him, and something in his expression curdled into open contempt. "Miss Calloway," Silas said, tipping his hat with mocking precision. "I see you've found yourself a new protector. Convenient timing." "I don't need protecting, Mr. Vance," Grace said. "I never have." "No," Silas agreed. "You've managed remarkably well for a woman with no family, no husband, and no business sense whatsoever, running this ranch into the ground for 2 years on nothing but stubbornness and charity." His smile did not reach his eyes. "Though I suppose now that the genuine article has returned, the charade is finished. Mr. Wade, you'll want to know that this ranch carries debts to my bank that have gone unaddressed for months, and I have documentation showing." "He's lying," Grace said flatly before Silas could finish. "Every debt on this ranch was settled 18 months ago. I have receipts for every dollar signed by your own clerk." "Documents can be misplaced," Silas said. "Records can be incomplete. And a woman's bookkeeping, however well-intentioned, doesn't carry the same weight in a county courtroom as a bank's official ledger." "Then it's a good thing," Jonah said, stepping forward, putting himself squarely between Silas Vance's horse and the porch, "that I'm home now to make sure your ledger gets read alongside her receipts in front of whatever judge you think is going to take your word over the truth." Something flickered across Silas's face, brief, almost imperceptible. But Jonah had spent 2 years learning to read the smallest signs of danger in a hostile landscape, and he recognized it instantly. Not confidence, fear quickly buried. "I'd think carefully before you make enemies your first day back, Mr. Wade," Silas said. "A great deal can happen to a man's cattle, to his fences, to his reputation in a town that's had 2 years to grow accustomed to a certain arrangement." "Is that a threat?" Jonah asked, his voice gone very quiet, very still. "It's a piece of friendly advice," Silas said. Gathering his reins, his smile stretched thin over something that looked for just a moment like genuine unease. "Welcome home, Mr. Wade. I do hope your homecoming is a peaceful one." He turned his horse, and his 3 riders turned with him, and they rode back down the long dirt road the same way they'd come, dust rising behind them like smoke from a fire that hadn't finished burning. Jonah watched them go, rifle still loose in his grip, and beside him, Grace let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the moment she'd first heard Otis shout. "He's never come this far onto the property before," she said. "He's always kept to town, to the bank, to the judge's office. This is the first time he's ridden all the way out here himself." "Because he's scared," Jonah said. "A man like that doesn't show his face unless he thinks the ground's shifting under him. He came out here to see with his own eyes whether I was real, and now he knows. That doesn't make him less dangerous. It makes him more." Jonah turned to look at her, and for the first time since he'd swung down off his horse ready to defend a ranch he'd expected to find in ruins, he let himself really see the woman who'd spent 2 years defending it in his absence. Not the intruder he'd nearly shot. Not the stranger with an unfamiliar name. A woman who had walked into a fight that wasn't hers against a man with money and lawyers and the easy cruelty of the powerful, and had held the line for 2 years without once asking anyone to thank her for it. "You've been fighting him alone," Jonah said, "this whole time." "Not entirely alone. Otis helped where he could. Sheriff Boone's been fair mostly, though his hands are tied by what the law allows him to do without proof. But yes, mostly alone." "Not anymore," Jonah said. Grace looked at him, and something in her carefully guarded expression cracked just slightly, just enough for Jonah to see the exhaustion underneath 2 years of carrying a weight most people in this valley would never have believed a woman like her could carry, let alone carry alone. "You don't know me, Mr. Wade," she said quietly. "You don't owe me your fight." "I already told you," Jonah said. "I don't much care what I owe you. I care what's right. And a man threatening a woman on my land over debts that were already paid using lies dressed up as paperwork, that's not right by any measure I was raised to understand." He paused, and something gentler moved through his voice. "Besides, seems to me you've been carrying this alone long enough." They stood together on the porch as the dust from Silas Vance's departure settled back into the road, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised them both. "You should eat something," Grace finally said, turning back toward the door. "That bread's not going to bake itself, and you look like a strong wind could knock you flat." "Is that concern I'm hearing, Miss Calloway?" "That's practicality," Grace said, though something in her tone had softened. "A half-starved rancher isn't much use defending a ranch from a man like Silas Vance." Jonah almost smiled the first time, in longer than he could remember that the muscles of his face had even considered the shape of one. "Practicality," he repeated. "I can live with that." He followed her back inside, and for the first time since he'd ridden down out of the mountains, believing there was nothing left in this valley worth returning to, Jonah Wade felt something that had been frozen solid in him for 2 years begin cautiously to thaw. That evening after the sun had gone down, and Otis had retired to the bunkhouse with a satisfied grunt about the mare's foreleg not being as bad as he'd feared, Jonah sat across the kitchen table from Grace, a proper meal between them for the first time, and found himself asking questions he hadn't planned to ask. "Tell me about your husband," he said. Grace's spoon stilled over her plate. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because you said you were a widow before you ever came out here. I'd like to understand the woman who gave up everything to save a stranger's ranch. Seems the least I can do is know her a little." Grace was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Jonah wondered if he'd overstepped, if he'd pressed on a wound she didn't intend to show a man she'd known less than a single day. "His name was Daniel," she said finally. "We were married 4 years before the fever took him. He was a good man, gentle. Not much of a rancher, truth told. He'd been a school teacher before we married, and land work never suited his hands the way it needed to. When he died, I was left with debts I didn't fully understand, and a piece of land I had no idea how to keep. And the town. The town decided a widow my size with no husband to manage her affairs wasn't worth the trouble of helping. Some were kind enough, most weren't. Ezra Pruitt saw a woman he figured would fold quick and tried to collect on Daniel's debts twice over, once from me, and once I suspect from an insurance claim he never disclosed. I didn't know enough about business then to catch it. I was 2 days from losing everything I had left of my husband's memory, when a stranger rode up and paid what I owed, and rode off before I could even learn his name. And you spent 4 years trying to find out who he was." 2 years learning to survive on my own first," Grace said. "Then 2 years finding you." Jonah set down his fork. "Why didn't you write to me, if you knew my name?" "I tried," Grace said. "Twice. Both letters came back unanswered, and eventually the trail news said you'd gone missing entirely, and there was no one left to write to." She met his eyes steadily. "So I came instead. Letters can be lost or ignored. I decided I wouldn't be either." Something in Jonah's chest tightened an ache that wasn't grief this time, but something adjacent to it, something that felt dangerously close to hope, an emotion he'd trained himself out of somewhere in the second winter on the trail, when hope had felt like the most expensive thing a starving man could afford to carry. "I'm glad you didn't let yourself be ignored," he said quietly. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then she nodded once, brisk, as if setting the moment carefully aside before it could grow into something neither of them was prepared for yet. "Eat your supper, Mr. Wade," she said. "Tomorrow, Silas Vance is going to make good on whatever threat he was. Too much of a coward to say plain today, and you'll want your strength for it." "You think he'll move that fast?" "I think a man who rode all the way out here just to look you in the eye is a man who's already decided he can't afford to wait." She was right. The knock came before dawn, hard and urgent, against the front door, and when Jonah answered it with his rifle already in hand, Sheriff Boone stood on the porch, hat in hand, his face grim in the gray pre-dawn light. "Jonah," the sheriff said. "Heard you were back. Wish it was under better circumstances." "What's happened?" "Silas Vance filed papers with Judge Harmon last night. Claims of fraud against the ranch, says the debt payments Miss Calloway made were done under false pretenses, using money that wasn't rightfully hers to spend. He's asking the judge to void the payments entirely and reinstate the original debt, which with 2 years of interest would be more than either of you could hope to pay before the bank forecloses proper." Behind Jonah, he heard Grace's sharp intake of breath. "That's a lie," she said. "Every dollar I paid was mine from the sale of my own land. I believe you, Miss Calloway," Sheriff Boone said, not unkindly. "But belief and proof are two different animals in front of Judge Harmon, and Silas Vance has spent 2 years greasing every wheel in this county that might turn against him. You've got a hearing in 5 days' time. I'd advise you both to spend every one of them finding proof strong enough to shut this down for good. Because if you can't, this ranch and everything Miss Calloway built to save it is going to belong to Silas Vance before the month is out." Jonah stood in the doorway of the home his father had built, and his grandfather had built before, that the home Grace Calloway had bled and sacrificed 2 years of her life to protect, and felt the old familiar cold of the mountain trail settle back into his bones, a different kind of survival, now beginning one that would take more than a rifle and a strong back to win. 5 days, he said. 5 days, Sheriff Boone confirmed, and turned his horse back toward town, leaving Jonah and Grace standing together on the porch as the first gray light of morning began to climb over the eastern ridge and the fight for everything they'd both nearly lost began in earnest. "We'll need every receipt you have," Jonah said once the sheriff's horse had disappeared past the tree line. "Every letter, every signature, every scrap of paper that proves you paid that debt clean." "I have all of it," Grace said. "I learned early not to trust a man like Silas Vance with anything I couldn't prove twice over. But receipts alone may not be enough. Judge Harmon and Silas Vance have played cards together every Thursday night for as long as I've lived in this valley. I don't say that to frighten you. I say it because you should walk into this hearing knowing exactly what kind of fight it is. Then we'll need more than receipts." "Yes," Grace said. "We will." She turned and went inside, and by the time Jonah had seen to the horses and come back in himself, she already had a strongbox open on the kitchen table, papers sorted into neat, careful stacks, 2 years of a woman's discipline laid bare in ink and signatures. "You've kept every one of these," Jonah said, turning one over in his hands. A receipt for lumber dated, signed, witnessed by Otis's careful, blocky handwriting. "A woman without a husband's name behind her learns fast that her word alone means nothing to men like Ezra Pruitt or Silas Vance," Grace said. So I made sure my word never had to stand alone. Every purchase, every payment, every promise anyone made me, I got it in writing and I got it witnessed. That's not caution, Jonah said. That's armor. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night, Mr. Wade. It's kept this ranch standing for 2 years, and it's going to keep it standing 5 more days. They worked through the papers late into the morning, and Jonah found himself watching her more than he was watching the receipts, the way her mouth pressed thin with concentration, the way she never once complained about the weight of what she was carrying. Even now, even with everything on the line. Otis came and went, bringing coffee, offering what memories he had of dates and dealings, and by midday they had a stack of evidence that would have satisfied any honest judge in the territory. The trouble, as Grace had already warned him, was that Judge Harmon was not an honest judge. Not entirely. We need a witness Harmon can't ignore, Jonah said. Someone outside Vance's pocket. Someone the whole county trusts. There's one man, Grace said slowly. Reverend Cole keeps the county's marriage and death records at the church. If Vance forged papers claiming your father's death was uncertain, or that the ranch's ownership was ever in question after he passed, Reverend Cole's ledger would prove otherwise. He recorded your father's burial with his own hand. Would he testify? He's an honest man in a county that doesn't have many left, Grace said. But honest men can still be frightened, Mr. Wade. Silas Vance has a way of making trouble for anyone who stands against him. Reverend Cole has a wife and 3 children and a church roof that needs mending before winter. I won't ask him to risk that without telling him plain what it might cost him. Then we'll go into town together, Jonah said. Today. Grace hesitated just long enough for Jonah to notice. What? He said. You haven't been to town yet, Grace said carefully. Since you've been back. I only mean to say, Mr. Wade, that Millbrook Hollow has had 2 years to grow a certain kind of talk about me, and it isn't always kind. I'd rather you hear it from my own mouth before you hear it whispered behind a store counter. Tell me then. They call me the fat widow who thinks she can run a man's ranch. Grace said each word flat and steady, the practiced calm of someone who had said this to herself so many times. The sting had long since been worn smooth. Mrs. Pruitt in particular has made something of a hobby of it. I've learned to walk past it without flinching. I only tell you so that when you hear it, you don't do something foolish in my defense, and land yourself in worse trouble than the ranch is already in. Jonah felt something hot move through his chest, an anger he hadn't expected, sharp and sudden. That's not talk, he said. That's cruelty dressed up as gossip. It's both, Grace said. And it's Millbrook Hollow. I've made my peace with it because I had to. I didn't come here for their approval. I came here to keep a promise. Well, Jonah said, reaching for his hat. I didn't ride 2 years through hell to come home and let a town of cowards talk about the woman who saved my family's ranch like she's something to be ashamed of. Get your coat, Miss Calloway. We're going to see Reverend Cole, and if anyone in that town has something to say about it, they can say it to my face. Grace studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression guarded for so long that Jonah suspected she'd forgotten how to let it show any other way, softened just slightly at the edges. You don't have to fight my battles, Mr. Wade. I know, Jonah said. I'm choosing to anyway. The ride into Millbrook Hollow took the better part of an hour, and Jonah felt the weight of 2 years' absence settle over him the moment the first rooftops came into view. Familiar and strange all at once, like a dream half remembered. Heads turned as they rode down the main street together, Grace beside him rather than a step behind, and Jonah watched the whispers start before they'd even reached the church, watched the way certain eyes moved over Grace's figure with open, ugly judgment, before they'd even taken note of the man riding beside her. Well, I never... came the voice from the porch of the general store, sharp and carrying deliberately loud enough to be heard across the street. Mrs. Pruitt stood with her arms crossed, a smile on her face that held no warmth at all. Jonah Wade risen from the grave and riding into town with his little charity case right beside him, like she's earned the privilege. Jonah reined his horse in sharp. Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced. No need, Mrs. Pruitt said. Everyone in this town knows exactly who I am and exactly who your companion is. Tell me, Mr. Wade, has she told you yet how she near bankrupted my husband's store, trying to play at business she had no business playing at? Or is she saving that particular confession for after she's gotten her hooks properly into your ranch? She saved my ranch, ma'am. Jonah said, his voice gone very quiet, very even the voice of a man who had learned in 2 years of wilderness survival that the loudest reaction was rarely the most dangerous one. While the whole town, yourself included from the sound of it, stood by and let a widow twice wronged fend for herself against a man trying to steal what little she had left. I'd think carefully before you decide that's a story you want repeated back to you in front of Judge Harmon in 5 days' time. Mrs. Pruitt's smile faltered just slightly. I'm only saying what half this town already believes, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier bite. Then half this town owes Miss Calloway an apology, Jonah said, and I intend to see that they get the chance to give it one way or another. He turned his horse without waiting for a response, and beside him, Grace rode on with her chin level and her eyes forward, betraying nothing of what the exchange had cost her, though Jonah didn't miss the faint tremor in her gloved hands where they held the reins. You didn't have to do that, Grace said quietly once they were out of earshot. Yes, Jonah said. I did. They found Reverend Cole in the small church at the edge of town, tending the modest garden along its south wall, and he straightened at the sight of them with an expression that shifted quickly from surprise to something more careful, more guarded, the look of a man who already suspected what they'd come to ask. Jonah Wade, the Reverend said. Word travels fast in this valley, but I confess I didn't believe it until I saw you standing here myself. Reverend, Jonah said, I expect you know why we've come. I expect I do. The Reverend set down his trowel, wiping his hands on his coat, his eyes moving between Jonah and Grace with something like sympathy. Silas Vance's hearing, 5 days from now. We need your ledger, Grace said. The burial record for Jonah's father. Proof his death was recorded properly, and proof the debt payments I made were made after his passing was already a settled matter of county record, not the disputed claim Vance is trying to make it out to be. The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the small church behind him, its roof patched in places with mismatched shingles, its collection plate thin most Sundays in a town where money was scarce, and Silas Vance's bank held the paper on half the families within riding distance. You understand what you're asking, he said finally. Silas Vance has more influence in this county than any 10 men combined. If I testify against him and Judge Harmon sides with Vance regardless, as he very well might, I'll have made an enemy of the one man who could call in every debt this church owes and shutter it inside a month. I understand, Grace said. I would never ask you to risk your church, Reverend, if there were any other way. But there isn't. Not one I can find. Reverend Cole studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened. 2 years, Miss Calloway, he said. I watched this town turn its back on you. Watched women who call themselves good Christian souls whisper about your size and your business behind gloved hands while you rebuilt a dead man's ranch with your own 2 hands and never once asked for pity. I've prayed on what I owed you for a long while now, and I believe I have my answer. He held out his hand toward Jonah. I'll testify, and I'll bring my ledger, and I'll bring the truth, and if Silas Vance wants to make an enemy of this church for telling it, then let him try. Jonah shook the Reverend's hand, feeling for the first time since he'd ridden into this valley that the fight in front of them might actually be winnable. They rode back to the ranch as the afternoon sun slanted long and gold across the fields, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence between them easier now than it had been that morning, worn smooth by a shared purpose. Thank you, Grace said finally, for what you did in town. I've faced worse than Mrs. Pruitt alone plenty of times, but I won't pretend it didn't help having someone stand beside me instead of behind me for once. You shouldn't have had to face any of it alone, Jonah said. Not the town, not Vance, not 2 years running this ranch with nothing but an old man and your own 2 hands. I don't know what kind of person forgets a debt of kindness the way I forgot you, but I know now, and I intend to spend whatever time it takes making up for it. Grace glanced at him, something uncertain and hopeful moving behind her eyes. "You don't owe me that either, Mr. Wade." "Jonah," he said, "if we're going to stand in front of a judge together in 5 days and fight for this ranch, I expect you can call me Jonah." "Jonah," Grace repeated, testing the shape of it, and something in the way she said it settled into Jonah's chest, like a hand finding purchase on solid ground after 2 years of falling. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, like the beginning of something, instead of the tail end of a fight. But the peace didn't last past sundown. Jonah woke well past midnight to the smell of smoke and the frantic bawling of cattle, and by the time he'd pulled on his boots and grabbed his rifle, Otis was already pounding on the farmhouse door, his voice raw with alarm. "Fire in the north pasture. Somebody cut the fence and drove the herd toward it. Jonah, this weren't no accident." Jonah burst out into the yard to find the horizon-lit orange flames licking low and fast through the dry autumn grass. Cattle scattering in terrified confusion through the gap in a fence that had stood solid that very morning, cut clean through with wire cutters and not broken by chance. Grace was already there ahead of him, a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope in the other, her nightclothes hastily covered by her work coat, shouting orders to Otis with the calm authority of a woman who had faced disaster before and refused to let it own her. "Jonah, the west gate. We need it open before the herd panics further into the fire line. Otis, get the water barrels. We can't lose that pasture, or the winter feed goes with it." Jonah didn't ask questions. He ran. For the better part of an hour, they fought the fire and the frightened cattle together. Grace working alongside him without a single complaint about the smoke stinging her eyes or the exhaustion clearly dragging at her limbs. And when the last of the flames finally guttered out under wet sacking and trampled earth, the three of them stood in the ruined pasture breathing hard, faces streaked black with soot. "That fence didn't cut itself," Otis said grimly, holding up the severed wire for Jonah to see the clean edge unmistakable in the lantern light. "No," Jonah said, his voice gone cold and flat. "It didn't." Grace stared out at the scorched pasture, at the herd still skittish and scattered along the tree line. And when she spoke, her voice carried none of the fear Jonah might have expected, only a hard, weary resolve. "5 days isn't enough time anymore," she said. "Silas Vance just showed us exactly how far he's willing to go to make sure we never make it to that hearing at all." Otis knelt at the fence line, running his thumb along the severed wire one more time, and when he looked up, his face had gone hard, in a way Jonah hadn't seen on the old man since the day he'd arrived. "Cut clean," Otis said. "Not chewed through by weather, not snapped by weight. Somebody stood right here with a pair of shears and took their time about it." "Whoever it was knew exactly which fence to cut," Grace said. "The north pasture backs right up against the ravine. Cut that line and drive the herd hard enough, and half of them go over the edge in the dark before anybody even smells smoke. They weren't trying to burn us out," Jonah said slowly, understanding dawning cold in his chest. "They were trying to kill the herd, make it look like an accident nobody could pin on anybody." "And if the herd dies," Grace said, "there's no ranch left worth fighting a hearing over. Vance doesn't need to win in front of Judge Harmon if there's nothing left to win." Otis spat into the scorched grass. "Man's a coward. Sends riders in the dark instead of showing his own face." "He showed his face plenty this afternoon," Jonah said. "This is what a man does after he's been told no to his face and doesn't like the answer." Grace was already moving, counting heads in the shifting, restless herd by lantern light, her lips moving silently as she tallied. Jonah watched her work, watched the way panic never once touched her hands, even as her voice stayed clipped and urgent. 12 short, she said finally. "Could be scattered in the dark, could be over the ravine. We won't know till first light." "Then we wait for first light," Jonah said. "And we ride the ravine ourselves before Vance's men have a chance to come back and finish the job." "You think he'd try again tonight?" "I think a man desperate enough to cut a fence in the dark isn't done being desperate." They didn't sleep. Jonah stood watch on the porch with his rifle across his knees, while Otis kept to the barn, and Grace moved between the house and the yard, unable to sit still, unable to stop counting losses in her head. Somewhere past 3 a.m, she came out and sat on the porch step beside him, close enough that he could feel the tension radiating off her like heat off a stove. "You should sleep," Jonah said. "So should you. I've gone longer than this without sleep. 2 years teaches a man to run on less than he thinks he can." 2 years teaches a person a lot of things, Grace said quietly. "I learned how to sit up all night waiting for trouble that hadn't come yet. I got very good at it. I don't know if that's something to be proud of." "It kept this ranch standing," Jonah said. "I'd call that something to be proud of." Grace didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone smaller than Jonah had heard it, yet stripped of the armor she wore like a second skin in daylight. "Some nights, I used to sit right here and wonder if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Selling everything I had left to save a ranch that wasn't mine for a man who might never come home at all." She looked out at the dark tree line where the herd had scattered. "I told myself it didn't matter whether you came back or not, that I was doing it because it was right, not because I wanted anything from you." Was that true? Mostly. And the rest of it. Grace turned to look at him, and in the low lantern light, Jonah could see the exhaustion and the honesty warring behind her eyes. "The rest of it was that some nights, I hoped you would come home and see what I'd built, and think it was worth something. Worth staying for." She said it plainly without flinching, the same way she'd told him she was the reason his barn still had a roof. "I know how foolish that sounds, hoping a stranger's opinion might matter that much." "It doesn't sound foolish," Jonah said. "It sounds like the only reason a person keeps fighting a battle, nobody's paying them to fight." Their shoulders were nearly touching now, the space between them charged with something neither of them had named yet, and for a moment, Jonah thought he might close that distance entirely. Then a horse whinnied sharp and frightened somewhere out past the barn, and both of them were on their feet before the sound had finished echoing. "Stay behind me," Jonah said, rifle already up. "I don't stay behind anybody on my own land," Grace said, and grabbed the shotgun leaning by the door before following him down the steps. They found Otis in the barn breathing hard, a bloody gash along his forearm, standing over a man in dark clothes who was very much not supposed to be there. "Caught him trying to run off 2 more head through the side gate," Otis said, pressing his good hand against the cut. "Had to convince him to stay a spell." The intruder, young, scared now that the fight had gone out of him, tried to scramble backward and found Jonah's rifle leveled square at his chest before he'd made it a foot. "Name," Jonah said. "I ain't telling you nothing. You're trespassing on private land. In the middle of the night you assaulted an old man and you were caught stealing cattle. Sheriff Boone is going to want a name, and you can give it to him easy, or you can give it to him with a few less teeth. Your choice." The young man's eyes darted between Jonah Grace and the shotgun she held steady, despite her exhaustion, and something in him seemed to fold. "Tommy Reese," he said. "I didn't want no part of this. Mr. Vance paid good money, said it'd be quick and quiet, said nobody'd get hurt." "Vance sent you," Grace said, stepping forward. "You'll say that in front of Judge Harmon, in writing, signed." "He'll kill me for that." "He'll do worse to you if you don't," Jonah said. "Right now you're a scared boy caught stealing. Say Vance's name plain and you're a witness with the law on your side. Keep your mouth shut, and you're the only man standing trial when this is through, because Silas Vance isn't fool enough to leave his own fingerprints on this." Tommy Reese's shoulders sagged the fight, and the fear both draining out of him at once. "He said if I got caught to say I was acting alone. Said he'd see me looked after if I kept quiet." He looked up at Jonah, young and frightened, and suddenly very tired of being afraid. "He didn't say nothing about looking after me if I talked." "Then don't talk to him," Jonah said. "Talk to us." By the time the sun came up, Sheriff Boone had Tommy Reese in the county jail and a signed statement in his hand naming Silas Vance as the man who'd paid him to cut the fence and run off the herd. Boone read it twice at the kitchen table, his face carefully unreadable before he finally spoke. "This is good," he said. "This is real good. But I'll be honest with you both. A scared boy's confession against a banker with half the county in his pocket is still an uphill climb in front of Judge Harmon." "It's a start," Jonah said. "It's a start," Boone agreed. "You'll need more than a start in 4 days' time." Grace had gone very quiet at the table. Her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking, and Jonah recognized the look on her face. The look of a woman doing arithmetic on a debt that kept growing no matter how much she paid against it. "There's something else," she said finally. "Something I haven't told either of you." Jonah felt his stomach tighten. "What?" 18 months ago, when I paid off the original debt, Silas Vance's bank required a co-signature on the release papers. Since I wasn't blood kin to Jonah and the ranch was legally still his, even in his absence the bank insisted someone with standing in the county witness and co-sign the transaction. She set down her cup. Ezra Pruitt co-signed. "Mrs. Pruitt's husband," Jonah said. "The same man who tried to auction off my land 4 years ago. The same man whose wife called me a charity case in the middle of Main Street yesterday." Grace's jaw tightened. "I always suspected he only agreed to co-sign because Vance asked him to as a favor, expecting he'd need Pruitt's cooperation again someday to undo it. If Vance can convince Pruitt to claim he was pressured or deceived into signing or simply to disappear before the hearing, that co-signature stops being proof of an honest transaction and starts being one more thing for Judge Harmon to doubt. Then we need Pruitt to testify honest," Jonah said, "before Vance gets to him. Ezra Pruitt has never once in 4 years done anything that wasn't in his own interest," Grace said. "I don't know what could convince him to cross Silas Vance." "Then we find out what he wants more than he's afraid of Vance," Jonah said. "Every man's got a price, or a fear bigger than his caution. We just have to find his." Sheriff Boone stood settling his hat back onto his head. "I'll see what I can learn about Pruitt's dealings with the bank. Man's been drowning in debt to Vance for 2 years himself, if the rumors are true. Might be there's more than one person in this county tired of being under Silas Vance's thumb." He rode out, and the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that came after a storm everyone knew wasn't finished yet. That afternoon, while Jonah and Otis worked to repair the cut fence line, a wagon rolled up the long dirt road slow and deliberate, and Jonah recognized the driver before the wagon had even come to a stop. Ezra Pruitt climbed down stiffly, older and more worn than Jonah remembered from years back. His coat threadbare at the cuffs, despite owning the largest store in town, and he stood at the edge of the yard like a man who'd talked himself into something on the ride over and was already regretting it. "Mr. Wade," Pruitt said. "Miss Calloway, I'd like a word if you'll have me." "Last time we spoke, sir," Grace said, coming out onto the porch, her voice cool. "You were trying to auction off everything I owned in front of half the county." "I know it," Pruitt said, and something in his voice cracked old shame surfacing after years of burial. "I've thought on that day more than you'd believe, Miss Calloway. I'm not proud of the man I was. I did it because Vance held paper on my store, and he made it plain what would happen if I didn't cooperate. I told myself it wasn't my concern what became of you after. That's a lie men tell themselves to sleep easy." "Why are you here now?" Jonah asked. "Because Vance came to my store this morning," Pruitt said. "Told me plain that when this matter goes before Judge Harmon, I'm to say I was coerced into co-signing your debt release. Says if I don't, he'll call in every note I owe him at once, and I'll lose my store inside a month." He looked between them, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "I've spent 2 years watching that man squeeze this town dry, taking a little more from each of us every season until we've got nothing left to bargain with. I let him make me a coward once already with your land, Miss Calloway. I find I don't have the stomach to do it twice." Grace stared at him, careful, guarded a woman who had been burned too many times to trust an apology on its face alone. "What do you want, Mr. Pruitt?" "I want to tell the truth," Pruitt said. "That you paid your debt honest with money that was rightfully yours, and I co-signed it clean of my own will, no coercion on your part whatsoever. I'll say it in front of Judge Harmon, and I'll say it knowing full well what Vance will do to my store for it." "Why?" Jonah asked again, sharper this time. "A man doesn't risk everything he's built for a guilty conscience alone." Pruitt's eyes went to Grace, and something old and sorrowful moved through them. "Because my daughter came home from church yesterday crying," he said. "Some of the other children had been repeating what their mothers said about Miss Calloway in town. Called her cruel things. My own daughter, not yet 10 years old, asked me if it was true that fat women couldn't be good at anything. I didn't have an answer for her that didn't shame me. His voice wavered. I've spent 2 years letting my wife say things about you I never once corrected Miss Calloway, because it was easier than crossing her or crossing Vance. I find I'm tired of easy costing more than it's worth. The yard went quiet. Grace's composure, so carefully maintained through every threat and every insult since Jonah had arrived, finally cracked just at the edges, just enough for Jonah to see how deep 2 years of cruelty had actually cut beneath the calm surface she showed the world. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," she said finally, her voice not quite steady. "I know what this will cost you. It'll cost less than staying quiet already has," Pruitt said, and climbed back into his wagon before anyone could say anything more, driving back toward town with his shoulders set like a man walking toward a fight he'd finally decided was worth having. Jonah watched him go, then looked at Grace, who was staring after the wagon with an expression he couldn't quite name. "That's 2 witnesses now," he said. "Reverend Cole and Ezra Pruitt. Vance is losing ground faster than he expected." "He'll feel that," Grace said. "And a cornered man is more dangerous than a confident one. We should expect him to come harder now, not softer." She was right again, though neither of them could have predicted exactly how. The following morning, Jonah rode into town alone to speak with Judge Harmon's clerk about the hearing schedule, and he'd barely tied his horse outside the courthouse when he heard raised voices coming from inside the bank across the street. He crossed without thinking twice and found Silas Vance standing behind his desk, face flushed with barely restrained fury, while Sheriff Boone stood opposite him, arms crossed, entirely unmoved. "You have no authority to search my private records." "Sheriff," Vance was saying, "I'll have your badge for this kind of harassment. I've got a signed statement from a boy in my jail naming you as the man who paid him to sabotage the Wade Ranch," Boone said, unruffled. "That gives me all the authority I need to ask a few questions about your recent dealings, Mr. Vance, unless you've got something to hide." "I have nothing to hide," Vance snapped, "beyond the ordinary discretion any businessman is entitled to." Jonah stepped into the doorway, and Vance's eyes cut to him immediately, something ugly moving behind the practiced calm. "Mr. Wade," Vance said, recovering his composure with visible effort. "Come to accuse me of something else, arson, perhaps cattle rustling. I confess I'm running out of guesses." "I came to tell you Ezra Pruitt's going to testify at the hearing," Jonah said. "Says he co-signed Miss Calloway's debt release of his own free will, and that you threatened to ruin him if he didn't lie about it." Something flickered across Vance's face, quick and involuntary, and Jonah recognized it now, the same flash of fear he'd seen the first day Vance had ridden out to the ranch. "Pruitt is a weak man prone to exaggeration," Vance said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "I'm sure whatever he's told you has been colored by guilt over his own dealings." "Funny," Jonah said. "That's near enough what you told Miss Calloway about her own testimony not mattering the day you rode out to threaten her on my land. Seems like every witness who tells the truth about you turns into an unreliable exaggerator real quick." Vance's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, showing something colder and more desperate underneath the tailored coat and practiced charm. "You should have died out there, Wade," Vance said quietly, the words dropping like stones into the room. "It would have been simpler for everyone." The room went very still. Sheriff Boone's hand drifted toward his sidearm without quite resting on it, a warning as much as a reflex. "Simpler for you maybe," Jonah said, his voice gone flat and cold. "You've had 2 years to steal that ranch clean, and the only thing that ever stood in your way was a woman. This whole town decided wasn't worth taking seriously. You underestimated her, same as everybody else did, and now you're going to answer for every dirty trick you've pulled trying to fix that mistake." Vance said nothing, but the look on his face, the raw, ugly panic beneath the fury, told Jonah everything he needed to know. This was a man who had been so certain of his own untouchability that Grace Calloway's stubborn survival had become an unbearable insult, and now that insult was about to become his ruin in front of the entire county. "We'll see you at the hearing, Mr. Vance," Jonah said, and walked out before the banker could recover enough to answer. He found Sheriff Boone waiting for him outside a few minutes later, having extracted himself from whatever remained of the conversation inside. "That man just threatened your life in front of a county sheriff," Boone said. "I heard it plain." "So did you. That count for anything at the hearing?" "It might," Boone said. "Might also make him more careful about how he comes after you next time, which worries me more than a man fool enough to threaten you to your face." He clapped Jonah on the shoulder. "Get on home, Jonah. Watch that ranch close tonight. A man that desperate doesn't wait long between mistakes." Jonah rode back to the ranch as the sun climbed high overhead, turning the threat over in his mind, and by the time he reached the yard, he'd made a decision he hadn't fully voiced yet even to himself. Grace was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her face tight with worry. She'd clearly been carrying the whole ride. "Otis told me you rode into town alone," she said. "After everything that's happened, you didn't think to say where you were going. Didn't figure I needed to ask permission to visit the courthouse." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Grace's voice had an edge to it Jonah hadn't heard before, something that sounded almost like fear dressed up as anger. "Vance already tried to kill your herd once. You rode into the one town where he holds every advantage completely alone without telling anyone where you'd gone." "I can take care of myself, Grace." "I know you can," she said, and something in her voice cracked the anger draining away into something raw. "That's not the part that frightens me." Jonah went still. "Then what does?" Grace looked away from him out toward the fields, her jaw working like she was deciding whether the truth was worth the risk of saying it out loud. "I spent 2 years telling myself I came here to pay a debt," she said finally. "That I'd feel it was settled the day you rode home safe and the ranch was secure, and I could go on with whatever was left of my life. I told myself that so many times I nearly believed it." She turned to face him. "And then you rode into town today without a word, straight into the path of a man who just told a county sheriff he wished you'd died in those mountains. And I realized somewhere in the last 3 days this stopped being about a debt entirely." "Grace, I don't know what to do with that," she said, her voice unsteady, now stripped bare of the composure she'd worn like armor, since the moment he'd nearly shot her on this very porch. "I don't know how to want something for myself, after spending years learning not to want things I couldn't have." Jonah crossed the porch and took her hand, gentle, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. "I rode out of these mountains believing there was nothing left in this valley worth coming home to," he said. "I was wrong about a great many things these last 3 days, Grace Calloway, but I've never been more certain of anything than I am that you're the reason I still have a reason to fight for any of it." For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with 2 years of loneliness on both sides finally finding somewhere to rest. And then the sound of a rider coming hard up the road broke the moment apart before either of them could close the last distance between them. Otis came around the side of the barn at a dead run, his face white. "Jonah, Miss Grace, it's Reverend Cole. Somebody set fire to the church last night. Whole east wing's gone, and Reverend Cole's missing." Jonah didn't wait to hear more. He was in the saddle before Otis had finished speaking, and Grace was right behind him, refusing his half-formed suggestion that she stay at the ranch with a single sharp look that ended the argument before it began. They rode into Millbrook Hollow to find the sky over the church stained gray with smoke. Half the town already gathered in the street, buckets passing hand to hand, though the worst of the blaze had already burned itself out against the stone foundation. The east wing, where Reverend Cole kept his study and his ledgers, was a blackened ruin, timbers still smoldering. The small garden he'd been tending only days before, trampled to mud by a dozen frightened, useless feet. "Where's the Reverend?" Jonah shouted, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. No one answered right away. Faces turned toward him, uncertain, frightened, the same faces that had whispered cruelty about Grace 2 days earlier, now looking lost and small in the face of real disaster. "Nobody's seen him since last night," a woman finally said. "His wife's beside herself. Says he went back to the church after supper to fetch something and never came home." Grace's face had gone pale and hard at once. "The ledger," she said quietly, only for Jonah to hear. If he went back for the ledger before the fire started, and someone was waiting for him? She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Jonah pushed through the gathered crowd toward the ruined east wing, calling the Reverend's name, and it was Otis circling around toward the small cellar door at the rear of the church who found him first. "Over here. He's alive, but he's hurt bad." They found Reverend Cole slumped against the cellar wall, blood matting the side of his head. His left arm bent at a wrong angle. He was clearly trying not to look at, but his eyes were open, and when he saw Jonah, his cracked lips managed something that might have been the ghost of relief. "Jonah," the Reverend rasped. "Miss Calloway. Thank God." "Don't talk," Jonah said, kneeling beside him, checking the wound at his head with careful hands. "We'll get you to the doctor." "No," Cole said, gripping Jonah's sleeve with more strength than his condition should have allowed. "Listen to me first. 2 men came last night, masked. Wanted my ledger, the burial records, everything tying your father's death to a proper legal date. I wouldn't tell them where it was kept." His breath rattled wet in his chest. "They struck me, threw me down here, set the fire to make it look like an accident that took the records along with it." "Did they get the ledger?" Grace asked, her voice tight with dread. Reverend Cole's mouth twitched, something almost like a smile breaking through the pain. "No," he said. "I moved it 3 days ago. The moment you asked for my testimony, Miss Calloway, I knew what kind of men I might be dealing with. It's buried under the floorboards of my own bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth, safe as anything in this county can be safe from Silas Vance." Relief and fury washed through Jonah in equal measure. "You knew this might happen." "I suspected," Cole said. "I didn't think they'd be fool enough to burn a church to hide it. Desperation makes men do foolish things, Mr. Wade. I expect Silas Vance is more desperate than either of us understood." Sheriff Boone arrived minutes later, and between Reverend Cole's account and the fresh evidence of arson and assault, his expression had gone from grim to something harder, something closer to open resolve. 2 counts of assault arson against a church, attempted destruction of evidence in an active county matter, Boone said, counting the charges off on his fingers as the doctor arrived to see to the Reverend's arm. "That's not a case I can look the other way on, even for a man with Vance's money. Judge Harmon himself is going to have a hard time pretending this doesn't matter." "Harmon's been in Vance's pocket for years," Grace said. "Why would this change anything?" "Because burning down a church in a county full of God-fearing folk isn't the same as squeezing a widow's ranch out from under her," Boone said. "Vance could count on plenty of people looking away from the second kind of cruelty. Nobody in this town is going to look away from the first." Jonah watched the crowd gathered around the smoldering church, watched the way their faces had shifted since he'd first ridden in that morning. Fear curdling slowly into something angrier, something that looked for the first time since he'd come home like a town remembering it had a spine. Mrs. Pruitt stood at the edge of the crowd, her earlier venom entirely absent. Her hands pressed to her mouth as she stared at the ruined wing of the church her own children had been baptized in. When her eyes met Grace's across the churchyard, something passed between them that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't nothing either. "He's gone too far this time," Grace said quietly. "Even the people who never wanted to believe me are going to have a hard time explaining this one away." "That's exactly why it worries me," Jonah said. "A man backed into a corner with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind there is. He's not trying to win quiet anymore. He's trying to burn down anything that might stand as proof against him." "Then we need to move faster than he can burn," Grace said. They rode back to the ranch as evening settled over the valley, exhaustion dragging at all 3 of them. But Jonah noticed the change in Grace immediately, something steelier and more certain replacing the fear that had gripped her outside the church. She sat straighter in the saddle. Her jaw had set in a way that reminded him not for the first time of the woman who'd stood unflinching on his porch with a rifle pointed at her chest 3 days earlier. "There's a way to end this before the hearing," she said, as they turned up the long dirt road toward home. "Not just survive it, end it." "I'm listening." Vance's bank charter requires him to maintain proper records of every loan and every foreclosure filed in this county, available for inspection by the Territorial Banking Commission if a formal complaint is made. I've suspected for 2 years that his books wouldn't survive that kind of scrutiny, not with how many widows and small farmers he squeezed out using the same tricks he tried on me. I never had proof enough to file a complaint that would be taken seriously. She looked at Jonah, something fierce and determined burning behind her tired eyes. Now we have Tommy Reese's confession, Ezra Pruitt's testimony, Reverend Cole's ledger, and evidence of arson and assault tied directly back to Vance's desperation to hide all of it. That's not just enough to win a property hearing anymore, Jonah. That's enough to end Silas Vance's career in this county for good. You want to file a complaint with the Territorial Banking Commission. I want to burn his whole operation down around him, Grace said, the same way he tried to burn down every piece of proof standing against us. Legally. Completely. So there's no coming back from it, no second chance to try this again on some other widow with no one standing beside her. Jonah looked at her. This woman, who 3 days earlier he'd nearly shot on his own porch, now sitting straight-backed in the saddle beside him, with a plan that could bring down the most powerful man in the county, and felt something that had nothing to do with debt or gratitude settle firmly into place in his chest. Then that's what we'll do, he said. Tomorrow, we ride for the territorial office. Whatever's left of these 4 days, we spend it making sure Silas Vance never has the chance to do this to anyone else again. Grace nodded once, sharp and certain, but as they crested the final rise toward the ranch house, her horse suddenly shied, ears pinned back, and Jonah's own mount tensed beneath him at the same moment he caught the smell drifting on the evening wind. Smoke. Fresh smoke. Coming from the direction of the barn. No. Grace breathed, already spurring her horse forward. Not the herd. Not tonight. They crested the last hill together, and Jonah's stomach dropped at what he saw waiting in the yard below. Not fire this time. Worse. 3 riders sat their horses in front of the farmhouse, torches burning in their hands, and standing between them and the house, rifle raised and alone, was Otis, one old man facing down 3 armed strangers with nothing but stubbornness and a shotgun that looked entirely too small for the odds against him. Jonah didn't slow his horse. He came down that hill at a dead run, rifle already swinging up, and the sound of his voice tore across the yard before he'd even reined in. Get away from him. The riders turned torches, guttering in the sudden wind of their own movement, and Jonah fired once into the air close enough that the nearest horse reared and nearly threw its rider into the dirt. Grace was right behind him, shotgun leveled, and between the two of them, bearing down fast, and Otis still standing his ground with a shotgun of his own. The arithmetic of the fight changed in an instant. This ain't worth dying over, one of the riders shouted, already wheeling his horse away. Vance didn't pay us enough for this. Then get off my land before I decide to make you regret taking his money at all, Jonah said, close enough now to see the fear plain on the man's face in the torchlight. They didn't argue. 3 riders broke and ran into the dark torches, bobbing wild as they went, and Jonah let them go, more concerned with the old man swaying on his feet in the yard than with chasing down men who'd already lost their nerve. Otis! Jonah swung down before his horse had fully stopped. You winged me in the shoulder before you come over that hill, Otis said, and only then did Jonah see the dark stain spreading through his shirt, the old man's face gone gray beneath the weathered brown of 40 years in the sun. Held 'em off best I could. Wasn't gonna let 3 cowards burn down a house I've kept standing longer than most of 'em have been alive. Grace was already at his side, tearing a strip from her own petticoat to press against the wound. Her hands sure and fast, despite the tremor Jonah could see running through her. You could have been killed, she said, fierce, frightened, angry all at once. Could have, Otis agreed, wincing as she tightened the bandage. Wasn't gonna be, though. Man my age, you learn there's worse things than dying. Letting somebody burn down what you spent your whole life building without putting up a fight is one of them. They got him inside, got the wound cleaned and properly dressed by lantern light, while Jonah kept watch at the window, rifle across his knees, waiting for a second wave that never came. By the time the doctor arrived from town near dawn, summoned by a rider Jonah had sent the moment the danger passed. Otis was pale but stubborn, refusing every suggestion that he rest anywhere but the porch chair where he could keep an eye on his herd, Bullet went clean through, the doctor said, packing his bag. He'll be sore a good long while, but he'll keep. Man's tougher than men half his age. Told you, Otis muttered, and even hurting even Gray with pain, there was something satisfied in the set of his jaw, the look of a man who'd stood his ground and meant to keep standing it. Grace sank onto the porch step beside him once the doctor had gone. Exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once, and Jonah watched her hands shake, now that there was nothing left to bandage, nothing left to hold steady for. 3 men with torches, she said quietly. He's stopped trying to hide what he's doing entirely. He's out of time and out of patience, Jonah said. 2 days left before that hearing, and every witness we bring in makes his case weaker. He's not thinking clever anymore. He's just trying to burn down whatever he can before the walls come in around him. Then we need to be smarter than him, Grace said, not just faster. Sheriff Boone arrived at first light, grim-faced at the sight of Otis's bandaged shoulder, grimmer still when he heard the account of 3 armed riders with torches. That's attempted murder now on top of everything else, Boone said. I'll have paper out on all 3 of them today, and I intend to lean hard on whichever one I catch first to give up Vance's name plain same as Tommy Reese did. He looked between Jonah and Grace, something calculating behind his tired eyes. But I'll tell you both something else. I rode out here partly to warn you, and partly because I had a wire come in this morning from the Territorial Banking Commission office. Grace went very still. You sent word already? I sent word the morning after the church fire, Boone admitted. Figured we didn't have time to wait on you filing it proper yourselves. Commission's sending a man out to review Vance's books on account of a formal complaint alleging fraud, forged records, and coercion against multiple parties in this county. He's due to arrive same day as your hearing. Something almost like a smile crossed the sheriff's weathered face. Judge Harmon can play cards with Silas Vance every Thursday night he pleases, but even Harmon isn't fool enough to rule against a banking commission investigator sitting in his courtroom. Relief and fresh fear moved through Jonah in the same breath. Relief because for the first time the ground beneath their fight felt solid instead of shifting. Fear because a man as desperate as Vance had already proven he wasn't above burning down a church or putting a bullet in an old man's shoulder, and 2 days was still 2 days too many to assume he'd run out of ways to strike back. Thank you, Grace said, and meant it plain, the way she meant everything. Don't thank me yet, Boone said. Thank me when Vance is behind bars instead of behind his desk. Until then, keep your guard up. A cornered animal bites hardest right before it's caught. He rode out, and the ranch fell into the strange, taut quiet of a house bracing for a storm it could see coming, but couldn't yet stop. The 2 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Grace organized every scrap of evidence into careful order, indexing dates and signatures, until the strongbox held not just proof, but a story any judge could follow plain. Jonah rode the fence lines twice daily with his rifle never far from reach, and Otis heeled slow but steady on the porch, refusing to be anything but useful, even from a chair sharpening tools and mending tack with his good arm, while he barked instructions at anyone who tried to make him rest. On the second morning, a folded note turned up nailed to the front gate. Unsigned, the handwriting cramped and deliberate. Jonah read it once and felt his jaw tighten before he handed it to Grace without a word. Withdraw your testimony or lose more than a fence next time. He's threatening us in writing now, Grace said, though her voice didn't shake the way it might have 5 days earlier. That's not the move of a careful man. That's the move of a man who's already lost and knows it. Careful men don't hire boys to cut fences or burn churches either, Jonah said, folding the note and setting it aside for Sheriff Boone. We keep going. This just proves we're close enough to scare him. That afternoon, Grace made him sit at the kitchen table and walk through every question a lawyer might throw at him, testing his account of the ranch's condition on his return, the timeline of his father's death, every detail Vance's counsel might try to twist. She was patient and exacting, correcting him gently when his answers ran too long, sharpening each response until it landed clean and simple. You'd have made a fine lawyer yourself, Jonah said after the 4th round. I've had 2 years of practice arguing for my own right to exist in this valley, Grace said. Might as well put it to use for something bigger than myself for once. And through it all, something kept building between Jonah and Grace that neither of them named out loud, a closeness forged in fire and gunfire, and long nights standing watch together until the night before the hearing. When Jonah found her alone in the kitchen, long after Otis had gone to bed, staring at the strong box of papers like she could will them into being enough. "You should sleep," Jonah said, echoing words she'd said to him days before. "I keep thinking of something I might have missed," Grace said, "some detail that could turn Harmon against us, even with everything we've gathered. You've done everything a person could do, Grace. Have I?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, the fear she'd kept so carefully hidden beneath 2 years of quiet strength showed plain on her face. What if it's not enough? What if tomorrow Harmon sides with Vance, regardless of every witness, every ledger, every scrap of proof we've bled for, and this ranch, everything I gave up my own life to save, still ends up in that man's hands? Then we'll fight it a different way, Jonah said. The Territorial Commission, the county, whatever's left to fight with. I won't let 2 years of your life be for nothing, Grace. Not while I've got breath in me. You keep saying things like that, Grace said, her voice unsteady now. Like you've already decided this ranch, this fight is worth staying for. I have, Jonah said simply. Why? Because somewhere in the last 5 days, this stopped being about a debt for me too, Jonah said, closing the distance between them. Slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to step back. I rode home believing I had nothing left in this valley worth fighting for. I was wrong, Grace. I've got everything worth fighting for standing right in front of me. She didn't step back. Jonah reached up gentle and brushed a strand of hair from her face, and Grace closed her eyes at the touch, like a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to be reached for with tenderness instead of demand. I'm frightened, she admitted so quietly he nearly missed it. Not of Vance. Of this. Of wanting something for myself after so long spent believing I didn't deserve to. You deserve it, Jonah said. You've always deserved it. This whole valley just took too long to see what was standing right in front of them. And then he kissed her soft and sure, and Grace's hands came up to grip the front of his shirt, like she was afraid the moment might dissolve if she let go. And for one suspended breath, the strong box of evidence, and the hearing waiting for them at dawn, and every threat Silas Vance had thrown at them faded into something distant and unimportant, beside the simple, staggering fact of 2 people who had each spent years believing they weren't worth staying for finally being proven wrong. They broke apart, slow foreheads still touching, and Grace let out a shaky breath that was half laugh, half something closer to tears. Tomorrow's going to be a fight, she said. Then let's rest tonight, Jonah said. So, we're ready for it. Neither of them slept much, but what little peace they found together. And when dawn broke, gray and cold over the valley, they rode into Millbrook Hollow, side by side, not as a stranger and the woman who'd saved his ranch, but as 2 people who had somewhere in the fire and fear of the last 5 days become something neither of them had expected to find again. The courthouse was packed tighter than Jonah had ever seen it, word of the church fire and the shooting having spread through the valley faster than any of them could have predicted. And when Judge Harmon banged his gavel to open the hearing, the room went silent with an anticipation that felt for the first time like the whole town was finally paying attention to a fight they'd spent 2 years ignoring. Silas Vance sat at his table, looking composed, his lawyer beside him. But Jonah caught the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands stayed folded, a shade too carefully on the table in front of him, a man performing calm for an audience he no longer fully controlled. This hearing concerns a claim of fraud filed by Mr. Silas Vance against the estate of the late Elijah Wade, currently held by his son Jonah Wade, with debt payments made on the estate's behalf by one Grace Calloway. Judge Harmon said, his voice flat, unreadable. Mr. Vance, you may present your case. Vance's lawyer rose smooth and confident, laying out the same claims Vance had made from the start, that the debt payments were made under false pretenses, using funds not rightfully belonging to Miss Calloway, that the ranch's ownership remained legally contested, given the uncertain circumstances of Jonah Wade's 2-year absence. Furthermore, The lawyer continued. We have reason to believe Mr. Elijah Wade's death itself occurred under circumstances that call into question whether any debt payments made afterward hold legal standing at all. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jonah felt Grace's hand find his beneath the table, gripping tight. What is Mr. Vance suggesting? Judge Harmon asked, and even his careful neutrality couldn't quite hide the surprise in his voice. We have a witness, the lawyer said, prepared to testify that Elijah Wade's death was not in fact natural, but occurred under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated, given the town's assumption at the time that his son, the rightful heir, would never return to press the matter. The courtroom erupted into noise, and Jonah felt something cold and furious settle into his chest, even as Judge Harmon banged his gavel for order. That's a lie, Jonah said, standing before he could stop himself. My father died of a heart failure in his sleep. The town doctor confirmed it. The town doctor, Vance's lawyer said smoothly, who has since passed away himself, leaving no one to confirm his findings beyond second-hand account. Reverend Cole recorded the death, Grace said, rising beside Jonah, her voice cutting clear across the murmuring crowd. In the county ledger, on the day it occurred, with the doctor's own signature, witnessed and dated. A ledger, the lawyer said, that was very nearly destroyed in a church fire just 2 nights past. One wonders how convenient it is that the sole surviving record happens to support Miss Calloway's version of events so precisely. The implication landed like a slap, and Jonah watched Reverend Cole, his arm still in a sling, rise slowly from his seat in the gallery, his face white with fury. Your Honor, the Reverend said, I was struck unconscious and left to burn alongside that ledger by men I have every reason to believe were paid by Mr. Vance himself. I would ask the court to consider which party in this room has demonstrated a willingness to destroy evidence and which has nearly died protecting it. Objection, Vance's lawyer said quickly. Unsubstantiated accusation. Sustained, Harmon said, though something in his expression had shifted, some careful calculation moving behind his eyes. Now, a man beginning to sense the ground was less solid beneath his usual arrangement than he'd assumed. Bring forward your witness, then, Harmon said to Vance's lawyer. Let's hear this account of suspicious circumstances. The witness who took the stand was a man Jonah didn't recognize, thin and nervous, his eyes darting toward Vance more than once before he spoke. And something about his manner set every instinct Jonah had learned in 2 years of wilderness survival on edge. State your name and your relation to this matter, Harmon said. Silas Vance pays my wages, Jonah said quietly to Grace before the man had even answered. Look at him. He can't stop looking at Vance for permission to breathe. The witness gave his account, halting uncertain, claiming he'd heard rumors of an altercation the night Elijah Wade died, rumors he couldn't quite source, details that shifted slightly each time Harmon pressed him for specifics, and by the time he finished, even Vance's own lawyer looked faintly uncomfortable with how thin the testimony had come out, sounding under scrutiny. Cross-examine Miss Calloway, Harmon asked, and something in his tone suggested he already suspected what was coming. Grace rose, and Jonah watched her cross to the witness stand, with the same unhurried steadiness she'd shown him the first morning. He'd pointed a rifle at her chest, a woman who had learned long ago that composure was its own kind of weapon. You say you heard rumors? Grace said. From whom? The witness hesitated. Folks talking. Which folks? Name one. I don't recall exact names. You don't recall? Grace repeated, letting the words sit in the silent courtroom. You've come before this court prepared to accuse a dead man of murder, and you can't recall a single person who told you so. I heard it around, the witness said, sweat beading at his hairline now. Isn't it true, Grace said, that you were hired at Millbrook Hollows Bank 3 months ago on Mr. Vance's personal recommendation after arriving in this county with no prior residence or employment history anyone can verify? The witness said nothing. Isn't it true that you've never once spoken to Reverend Cole or the late Dr. Ashford or anyone present at Elijah Wade's passing, and that every word of this testimony was given to you to memorize? Objection, Vance's lawyer said weakly, But the objection carried no conviction, and Harmon waved it away without comment, his eyes fixed on the witness now with open suspicion. The man's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of the silence that followed, and he mumbled something about needing to speak with counsel. Before excusing himself from the stand so quickly, he nearly stumbled over his own boots, leaving the courtroom, murmuring in a way that told Jonah the tide had already begun to turn, before a single piece of hard evidence had even been laid on the table. "Your Honor," Grace said before Harmon could call for the next matter, "the defense would like to call Ezra Pruitt." Pruitt rose from the gallery, and Jonah saw Mrs. Pruitt's face go white beside him, her hand darting out to grip her husband's sleeve, as if she could hold him back from whatever he was about to do. He gently freed himself from her grip, and something passed between them. An apology and a plea for understanding both at once, before he walked to the stand with his shoulders squared, like a man walking toward the only decent thing he had left to offer. "Mr. Pruitt," Grace said, "did you co-sign the release of the Wade Estates debt 18 months ago?" "I did." "Under what circumstances?" "Honest ones." Pruitt said, his voice steadier than Jonah expected. "You paid every dollar of that debt from your own funds. Miss Calloway and I witnessed the transaction plain and clean, same as I've witnessed 100 others in this county over the years." "And has anyone since pressured you to claim otherwise?" Pruitt's eyes flicked toward Vance, and something hard settled into his weathered face. "Mr. Vance came to my store 3 days past. Told me that when I testified today I was to say I'd been coerced or deceived into signing that Miss Calloway had misled me about the nature of the funds. Said if I didn't cooperate, he'd call in every note my store owes his bank at once, and I'd lose everything I've spent 20 years building." The courtroom stirred, a low wave of murmurs rippling through the gallery. "And what did you tell him?" Grace asked. "I told him," Pruitt said, "that I'd rather lose my store honest than keep it built on another lie. I've told enough of those in my life already. Miss Calloway mostly at your expense, and I find I'm done." Vance half rose from his seat. "This is perjury, Your Honor. This man is—" "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Harmon said sharply, and something in the judge's voice now carried a different weight than it had at the start of the hearing, the careful deference of a man used to protecting a comfortable arrangement, beginning visibly to crack. Pruitt stepped down, and as he passed back through the gallery, his wife rose to meet him, and whatever words passed between them were too quiet for Jonah to hear, but the way she gripped his hand said more than any testimony could have. "One further witness, Your Honor," Grace said, and nodded toward the courthouse doors where Sheriff Boone entered, leading a young man in shackles whose face Jonah recognized immediately. Tommy Reese shuffled to the stand, refusing to meet Vance's eyes, even from across the room, though Jonah saw the banker's jaw tighten at the sight of him regardless. "State for the court who paid you to sabotage the Wade Ranch's fence line 5 nights past," Grace said. "Silas Vance." Tommy said the words coming faster now that they'd already been said once in a signed confession, easier the second time. "Paid me $20. Told me to cut the north fence and drive the herd toward the ravine, make it look like an accident. Said if I got caught to keep his name out of it." "And do you see the man who paid you in this courtroom today?" Tommy finally looked up, finally met Vance's eyes across the room, and something in the young man's face, fear giving way at last to something steadier, made Jonah's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel for a boy who'd been caught stealing his cattle only days before. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said. "Right there. That's him." Vance said nothing, his composure fraying visibly now, and Judge Harmon called for a brief recess before the next matter could be entered, though the recess did little to slow the momentum building against the banker with every passing minute. When the hearing resumed, the courtroom doors opened once more, and a man Jonah had never seen before walked in, dressed in a fine gray suit, entirely out of place among the ranchers and shopkeepers, filling the gallery, a leather satchel under his arm. "Forgive the interruption, Your Honor," the man said. "I'm Nathaniel Gray, investigator with the Territorial Banking Commission. I was told to report to this courtroom regarding a complaint filed against the Millbrook Hollow Bank and its president, Mr. Silas Vance." The color drained from Vance's face so completely that Jonah could see it happen in real time, watched 2 years of careful, arrogant control crack open in front of the entire town he'd spent that time quietly terrorizing. "Your Honor," Gray continued, "I've spent the past 2 days reviewing bank records provided under commission authority. I'd like to submit findings relevant to this hearing if the court will permit it." Harmon, looking now like a man watching his careful arrangement collapse in real time, waved him forward with visible reluctance. "Mr. Vance's bank shows a pattern," Gray said, laying documents across the clerk's table with methodical precision, "of foreclosures and forced sales targeting widowed and unmarried property owners across this county over the past several years, frequently involving co-signed release papers, later disputed, and debt figures that do not reconcile with the bank's own recorded ledgers. In several instances, the discrepancies exceed what could reasonably be explained by clerical error. This is outrageous," Vance said, finally breaking his composure, entirely rising from his chair. "You cannot simply walk into my county's courtroom and—" "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Harmon said, and something in his voice now carried none of the careful deference it had held toward the banker moments before. Gray continued unbothered. "Regarding the specific matter before this court, the debt payments made by Miss Grace Calloway on behalf of the Wade estate were recorded properly funded from the documented sale of her own property and co-signed by Mr. Ezra Pruitt in a transaction that shows no irregularity whatsoever, aside from a curious note in Mr. Vance's private ledger seized this morning under commission authority indicating his intention to, and I quote, revisit the Calloway release once the Wade matter resolves in our favor." The courtroom went utterly silent. "That note is dated 18 months ago," Gray said. 2 full years before Mr. Vance filed his fraud claim against this ranch. "Your Honor, this is not a case of a debt improperly settled. This is a documented, premeditated scheme to seize a property through manufactured legal pretense carried out over a period of years against a woman with no family standing to defend herself." Vance's lawyer had gone very still beside him. Vance himself stared at the documents on the clerk's table, like a man watching his own execution being read aloud. "There's more," Gray said, and something in his tone made even Judge Harmon lean forward. "Records seized this morning also show payments from Mr. Vance's personal accounts to individuals within this county, including sums paid to a Mr. Thomas Reese, and payments consistent with the recent destruction of church property. I'll be forwarding all of this to territorial authorities for criminal review separate from this civil hearing, but I would encourage the court to weigh it accordingly in whatever ruling it makes today." Judge Harmon sat back in his chair, and for a long moment the only sound in the courtroom was the creak of old wood and the ragged breathing of a man whose entire scheme had just come apart in front of the very town he'd spent years manipulating. "Mr. Vance," Harmon said finally, "do you have anything further to offer this court, given what's just been presented?" Vance said nothing. He sat frozen, staring at the documents at the investigator at the courtroom, full of faces that had spent years deferring to him, and were now looking at him with something closer to disgust than fear. And then, without warning, he moved. Vance lunged sideways, not toward the door, but toward the small pistol Jonah hadn't even realized his lawyer carried in a holster beneath his coat, and for one frozen heartbeat, the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing, as Vance's hand closed around the grip. "Vance, don't!" Sheriff Boone was already moving, but he was too far, 3 long strides away, and Jonah didn't calculate the distance or the danger. He simply moved, throwing himself across the space between the gallery and the front tables and slamming into Vance's arm, just as the pistol cleared its holster. The gun fired into the ceiling plaster, raining down over the screaming courtroom, and then Jonah had Vance pinned face down against the table, the banker thrashing and shouting something incoherent about ruin and theft, and a valley that had never appreciated everything he'd built for it until Sheriff Boone arrived and wrenched the pistol from his hand, and the fight finally completely went out of Silas Vance. "Get him in irons," Boone said, breathing hard, his voice carrying to every corner of the stunned courtroom. "Attempted assault on top of everything else. He's done." They dragged Vance out through the courthouse doors in shackles, and the crowd that had spent 2 years whispering cruelty about a quiet widow and doubting a returning cowboy parted around him in silence. No one meeting his eyes, the arrogant confidence that had ruled this valley for years, finally completely broken. Judge Harmon banged his gavel once more, his voice unsteady now, a man forced at last to reckon publicly with everything he'd let slide for years in the name of a comfortable arrangement. Given the evidence presented today, he said, "This court finds no merit whatsoever in the fraud claims against the Wade estate. All debt payments made by Miss Grace Calloway are hereby confirmed as valid and lawful. The ranch remains in full the property of Jonah Wade." He paused, looking out over the courtroom at Grace standing beside Jonah with tears finally slipping free down her face after 5 days of holding them back. And this court further recognizes the extraordinary sacrifice made by Miss Calloway in the preservation of that property during Mr. Wade's absence. Sacrifice this county owes a debt of gratitude it can never fully repay. The courtroom erupted not in outrage this time, but in something that sounded unmistakably like relief, and Jonah pulled Grace into his arms right there in front of the entire town that had spent 2 years calling her worthless and held her while she finally let herself cry. Otis pushed his way through the crowd, his bandaged shoulder forgotten in the moment, and gripped both their hands at once, his own eyes bright and unashamed. "Knew it," he said, voice thick. "Knew the day you two stood together on that porch that this valley didn't stand a chance against the both of you." Reverend Cole made his way over next, his arm still bound in its sling, his weathered face split by a smile that seemed to take years off him. "The Lord has a way of putting the right people in each other's path, Mr. Wade. I confess I've rarely seen it happen quite so dramatically, but I'll not complain about the manner, only the outcome. Thank you," Jonah said, gripping the Reverend's good hand, "for everything you risked." "I'd risk it again," Cole said simply. "Some debts are worth the cost of paying." The crowd around them had shifted into something Jonah hadn't seen in this town since he'd ridden home 5 days earlier. Neighbors clasping hands, old grudges set aside in the shared relief of watching a tyrant finally answer for years of quiet cruelty. And then, cutting through the murmur of celebration, came a voice Jonah recognized, hesitant now in a way it had never been on the porch of the general store. "Miss Calloway." Grace turned, and Mrs. Pruitt stood there, twisting her gloved hands together. Her earlier venom entirely gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain that looked almost like shame. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Pruitt said, the words clearly costing her more than she'd expected. "I said cruel things about you more than once, and I let my husband carry the weight of a wrong I share the blame for. I watched you save a dead man's ranch with nothing but your own 2 hands, and instead of admiring it, I mocked you for it because it was easier than admitting what it said about the rest of us who never once offered to help." Grace studied her for a long moment, and Jonah watched the old caution war with something more forgiving in her expression. "I don't need your apology to know my own worth, Mrs. Pruitt," Grace said finally. "I learned that the hard way alone over 2 years. No one in this town made easy for me. But I'll accept it anyway, because holding on to anger the way you all held on to your judgments never once built a fence or fed a herd. I'd rather spend what's left of my time in this valley building something, not tearing it down." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes filled, and she nodded once sharp before retreating back into the crowd, and Jonah felt Grace's hand tighten in his. Not from anger this time, but from something that looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like the beginning of peace. Sheriff Boone found them as the crowd began to thin. Vance long since hauled off to the county jail, his shackles clinking loud in the sudden quiet of the courthouse steps. "Investigator Gray tells me the criminal charges will take some weeks to sort through proper," Boone said. "Fraud, arson, assault, attempted murder, there's enough here to keep territorial lawyers busy through the winter, but the civil matters settled clean, Jonah. This ranch is yours free and clear, and the county owes Miss Calloway here a debt it's going to be paying down in respect for a long while yet." "What happens to the men who rode out to the ranch with torches?" Jonah asked. "The ones who ran." "We'll catch them," Boone said. "Cowards like that don't run far once they hear their paymasters sitting in irons. Give it a week, they'll turn up trying to sell information for leniency." He tipped his hat toward Grace. "Miss Calloway, it's been an honor watching you prove this whole county wrong." He walked off toward the jailhouse, and for a moment, Jonah and Grace stood alone on the courthouse steps, the autumn afternoon light slanting gold across the dispersing crowd, the weight of 5 desperate days finally fully lifting from both their shoulders. "We did it," Grace said, like she still couldn't quite believe the words as she said them. "You did it," Jonah said. 2 years before I ever rode home, Grace. I just got here in time to watch you finish what you started." Grace looked up at him, something soft and unguarded in her face that Jonah suspected very few people in this valley had ever been allowed to see. "I don't know how to be done fighting," she admitted. 2 years of bracing for the next blow, I'm not sure I remember how to simply rest." "Then we'll learn together," Jonah said. "Seems only fair since you spent 2 years teaching yourself everything alone." He took her hand, and together they walked down the courthouse steps into a town that was slowly and imperfectly beginning to remember how to be decent to the people who deserved it. And behind them, the doors of Millbrook Hollows courthouse closed on the last chapter of Silas Vance's reign over a valley he'd spent years believing belonged to him alone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Jonah nor Grace had known in longer than either cared to admit, mornings that started with chores instead of dread evenings that ended with supper instead of bracing for the next disaster. But peace Jonah had learned 2 years ago in the mountains rarely arrived all at once. It came in pieces, and some of those pieces still had teeth. Sheriff Boone rode out on a gray morning 10 days after the hearing, his face carrying news before he'd even dismounted. "Caught the last of the 3 who came at you with torches," he said. "Cornered him outside Bozeman trying to sell his story to a territorial newspaper for traveling money. Fool thought he could make a profit off it instead of running clean." Boone shook his head, something grim and satisfied in the set of his jaw. "All 3 are talking now, each one trying to pin more of the blame on Vance than the last, hoping it buys them leniency. One of them let slip something you both should hear." Grace set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "What?" "Vance never meant to win that hearing outright," Boone said. "Man knew his case was thin, even before the church fire, even before the fence. His real plan, if the legal claim fell apart, was to burn the ranch to the ground the night before the hearing, so there'd be nothing left worth fighting over, win or lose. The torches you 2 ran off that night weren't meant to scare Otis. They were meant to finish the job." The words landed heavy in the kitchen, and Jonah felt Grace's hand find his, without either of them deciding to reach for the other, an old habit already worn smooth between them. "We got here in time," Jonah said, more to steady himself than to answer Boone. "You did," Boone agreed. "Man's facing more charges now than I've seen stacked against anyone in this territory in 20 years of wearing a badge. Arson, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud against 6 families going back years. Territorial court set his trial for the first week of December. I expect it'll be the talk of 3 counties before it's through." "And Judge Harmon?" Grace asked. "What becomes of a man who let all of it happen under his own bench for years because it was easier than crossing a friend?" "Harmon resigned 2 days past," Boone said. "Quiet as he could manage it, but word travels. I reckon shame does more to a man's conscience in the end than any court ever could, once the whole valley's watching him close enough that he can't pretend not to see what he's been letting slide." He rode off toward town, and Grace stood at the window a long while after watching the dust of his departure settle, something working behind her eyes that Jonah recognized now as the particular weight of a fight finally truly closing. "It's over," she said, like she was testing the words for the first time. "Mostly," Jonah said. "The parts that mattered most anyhow." Grace turned to look at him. Something had shifted in her since the hearing, a lightness that hadn't been there the day he'd nearly shot her on this same porch, though the careful watchfulness 2 years of struggle had carved into her hadn't disappeared entirely. Some things Jonah suspected never fully did. 2 days later, Sheriff Boone allowed them a short visit to the county jail, more out of courtesy than obligation, and Jonah felt Grace's hand tighten in his as they walked past the cells toward the one holding Silas Vance. The banker looked smaller behind iron bars than he ever had on horseback, or behind his fine desk. His tailored coat rumpled now, his composure worn thin by 2 weeks of confinement. "Come to gloat," Vance said, not bothering to rise from the narrow cot. "Came to see for myself that it was real," Jonah said. 2 years I spent believing there was nothing left in this valley worth saving. Turns out the only thing rotten in it was you." Vance's eyes cut to Grace, and something ugly and desperate flickered there, the last gasp of a man who had built his whole life on the assumption that people like her didn't fight back. "You'll regret this," Vance said. "You think this valley will remember you as anything but the widow who got lucky. I built half of what stands in that town. You built it on other people's ruin?" Grace said, her voice steady, unbothered by his venom, in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. "I don't need this valley to remember me as anything, Mr. Vance. I know what I did, and I know why I did it, and that's enough. It was always going to be enough whether you understood that or not." Vance said nothing more, and Jonah felt something settle finally in his chest. Not triumph exactly, but the quiet, solid relief of watching a man who had spent years wielding fear like a weapon discover too late that it had stopped working on the one person he'd most wanted it to break. They didn't speak of him again on the ride home. There was one more piece of unfinished business waiting for them, and it came in the form of Tommy Reese released into Sheriff Boone's custody, pending his testimony at Vance's trial, standing awkward and uncertain at the edge of the ranch yard a few days later, hat in his hands. "Didn't know where else to come," Tommy said when Jonah walked out to meet him. "Boone says my sentence'll likely be light on account of cooperating. Said I might do better finding honest work somewhere folks don't already know my face for what I did." "You looking for work?" Jonah asked. Tommy blinked clearly, not expecting the question. "I know I got no right to ask you for anything, Mr. Wade. I tried to steal your cattle, hurt Otis doing it. You also stood up in a courtroom and told the truth about a man plenty of grown men in this county were too afraid to cross," Jonah said. "That counts for something. Man makes a mistake at 19. Way I see it, the measure of him is what he does after, not the mistake itself." Grace came out onto the porch, studying the boy with the same careful, appraising look she'd once turned on Jonah the morning he'd raised a rifle at her. "We could use another hand come spring," she said. "Otis isn't as young as he used to be, whatever he claims otherwise, and this ranch is going to need more than 3 sets of hands if we mean to grow it back the way it deserves." Tommy's face did something complicated, disbelief and gratitude tangled together, too tight to separate. "You'd trust me. After everything. Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild," Grace said, and Jonah felt the old words settle warm in his chest, the same words a stranger had once said to her at an auction. 4 years back passed forward now, to another person, standing at the edge of ruin, wondering if anyone would bother reaching out a hand. "I intend to keep believing that Tommy Reese for as long as I'm able. Don't make me regret it." "No, ma'am," Tommy said, and something in his voice, young and fierce and grateful, told Jonah the boy meant every word of it. The church rebuilding began the following Sunday, half the county turning out with lumber and nails and casseroles, the same women who'd once whispered cruelty about Grace, now working elbow to elbow with her hauling timber for the new East Wing. Reverend Cole, his arm finally free of its sling, stood in the middle of the half-raised frame and delivered a sermon that had more than one hardened rancher wiping his eyes with a shirt sleeve. "We are not measured," the Reverend said, his voice carrying easy over the gathered crowd, "by how quick we are to judge a stranger, but by how honest we are willing to be when we discover we judged wrong. This church burned because a desperate man wanted to hide the truth. It rises again because this town decided finally to stop hiding from it." Mrs. Pruitt worked the whole afternoon beside Grace, hauling water and passing nails, and somewhere in the quiet labor of rebuilding what cruelty had tried to destroy. Something between the two women settled into an understanding that didn't need more words than they'd already spoken on the courthouse steps. "You've got sawdust in your hair," Grace told her at one point, and Mrs. Pruitt laughed a real laugh, startled out of her by the plainness of it. And Jonah, watching from atop the new roof beam he was setting, thought that sound alone was worth every torch and every threat the last 2 weeks had thrown at them. That evening, riding home in the fading autumn light, Grace was quiet beside him, and Jonah recognized the particular quality of her silence, now the kind that meant she was turning something over she hadn't yet found the words for. "What's on your mind?" he asked. "I keep waiting for the other blow to fall," she admitted. 2 years of bracing for the next disaster, I don't rightly know how to trust a quiet evening when it comes. Feels like tempting something. That's fair, Jonah said. I spent 2 years in those mountains learning the same lesson. Every peaceful hour felt like it was borrowed against a worse one coming. He glanced at her. Took me a long while to understand that a man can choose eventually to stop waiting for the ground to fall out from under him. Doesn't mean it never will again. Just means he decides not to spend every good day mourning a bad one that hasn't happened yet. Is that where you are now? Grace asked. Not waiting anymore. Jonah considered the question honestly before he answered it. Getting there. Faster than I expected if I'm honest, and I think I know exactly why. Grace's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something softer and more uncertain than that. You're going to make me ask. You, Jonah said simply. It's you, Grace. Every good thing that's happened to me since I rode down out of that mountain trail has had your hand in it somewhere. Hard to keep bracing for disaster when the person standing beside you keeps proving disaster doesn't get the last word. Later that night, after Otis had turned in and the house had gone quiet, Grace lingered at the kitchen window instead of heading to bed. And Jonah found her there, staring out at nothing in particular. Something pensive in the set of her shoulders. Daniel used to say something like that, she said before Jonah could ask. About not mourning a bad day that hadn't come yet. He was gentle that way. Never much good with a plow, but good with words, good at finding the light in a hard season. She turned to look at Jonah, something careful and searching in her expression. I loved him. I want you to know that plain before we go any further down this road together. What I feel for you doesn't erase what I had with him. It just sits alongside it. I'd never ask it to erase anything, Jonah said. A person doesn't get to where you are, Grace, carrying what you carry, without the people who shaped you along the way. Daniel's part of why you know how to love somebody patient and steady. I'm grateful to him for that, even never having met him. Grace's eyes filled not with grief this time, but with something like relief, the particular relief of finally being understood, without having to explain herself twice. Most men would want me to leave all that behind, she said. Pretend it never happened so they didn't have to share space with a ghost. I'm not most men, Jonah said. And you're not a woman who owes anybody the erasure of her own life just to make room for a new one. There's room enough in you for all of it, Grace. I've seen it. That's part of why I love you. That night, over a supper that had become as ordinary and as precious as anything Jonah had known in his life, Otis cleared his throat with the particular gravity of a man about to say something he'd been chewing on for days. Been thinking, the old man said. Come spring, this ranch is going to need more hands than the three of us can spare, especially if the herd grows back the way it ought to with the north pasture recovering. Figured I'd say plain what everybody at this table already knows, and nobody's bothered speaking out loud yet. He looked between Jonah and Grace with the frank directness of a man too old to waste time on delicacy. You two gonna marry, or are we all just going to keep pretending we don't see it? Grace went red to the roots of her hair, and Jonah nearly choked on his coffee. And for a moment, the kitchen filled with the kind of laughter that came only after weeks of holding too much tension too tightly. Otis, Grace said mortified. I'm an old man with a bullet scar and very little patience left for watching two people who plainly love each other tiptoe around saying so. Otis said entirely unrepentant, pushing back from the table and heading for the door with his empty plate. I'll leave you two to figure it out. Just don't take too long about it. I'd like to dance at a wedding before my knees give out entirely. He left them alone in the kitchen, and Jonah found himself looking at Grace across the same table where she'd once told him calm and unflinching that she'd spent 2 years saving a ranch that wasn't hers because somebody once told her everyone deserved a chance to rebuild. He's not wrong, Jonah said quietly. I've been thinking on it myself, more than thinking if I'm honest. Grace's hands went still around her cup. Jonah, I know it's fast, he said. I know most folks would call 3 weeks no time at all to know a person well enough to build a life alongside them. But I don't feel like I've known you 3 weeks, Grace. Feels more like I've known you longer than I've known myself some days, the way you see straight through to the parts of me I don't say out loud. I'm frightened. Grace admitted the same confession she'd made the night before the hearing, though it carried a different weight, now softer, less afraid of the fear itself. Not of you. Of believing something good is finally allowed to stay. I spent so many years being told in ways loud and quiet both that a woman built like me, alone like me, wasn't meant for the kind of life other women got handed easy. I built a whole life around expecting less so it wouldn't hurt so much when less was all I got. You never once seemed like a woman who expected less, Jonah said. Not from where I was standing. I watched you stare down a banker with more money than sense hold a rifle steady after 2 years of nobody helping you rebuild a ranch with your own hands, while half this town called you names behind your back. I've never in my life met anyone who deserved more grace, and I intend to spend whatever years I've got left making sure you know it. Grace's eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to blink the tears away before they fell. I don't need a big ranch or a fine house, she said. I never did. I just needed somewhere I was allowed to matter exactly as I am without earning it first. You've mattered since the day you paid a stranger's debt at that auction, Jonah said. You just never had anybody around worth telling you so. He reached across the table and took her hand. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them full instead of empty, the particular fullness of two people who had each spent years believing they weren't worth staying for finally allowing themselves to be found. The test of that quiet came sooner than either of them expected. 3 nights later, a storm rolled down out of the mountains, faster than anyone had predicted, and Jonah woke to Otis pounding on his door, shouting that the new calves born that week in the north pasture were caught out in the open with the herd scattering wild against the wind. We'll lose half of them if we don't move now, Otis shouted over the rising noise outside. Grace was already dressed and moving before Jonah had his boots fully on, and Tommy Reese, bunking in the old hands' quarters since Grace had taken him on, met them in the yard with a lantern already lit. No hesitation in him at all, despite the driving rain. Tell me where you need me, Tommy said, and Jonah felt something settle at the boy's steadiness. The last traces of the frightened thief who'd been caught stealing cattle weeks before. Nowhere in evidence now. They worked through the worst of it together, 4 of them fanning out across the north pasture in the driving rain, herding frightened calves back toward the barn. One stubborn animal at a time. Grace hauling a newborn twice her own weight in her arms when its mother panicked and bolted, refusing to set it down, even as the mud pulled at her boots and the wind tried to steal the breath from her lungs. Let me take it, Jonah shouted, reaching for the calf. I've got it, Grace shouted back, and something in her voice, fierce and unyielding, told him arguing would waste more time than it saved. By the time the worst of the storm passed and the herd stood accounted for inside the barn, all 4 of them were soaked through and shaking with exhaustion, but not a single calf had been lost. And when Jonah looked around at Otis catching his breath against a stall post, at Tommy, grinning despite the mud caked to his face, at Grace leaning against him with rain still dripping from her hair, he felt something settle deep and certain in his chest. We make a good crew, Otis said, wheezing a little but grinning wide. We make a good family, Grace said, and then went still as if surprised by her own word choice, glancing up at Jonah to see how he'd taken it. We do, Jonah said simply, and watched relief and something warmer bloom across her tired face. They sat together in the hayloft afterward, too spent to make the walk back to the house just yet. Watching the last of the storm clear off toward the eastern ridge, and Grace rested her head against his shoulder. Exhaustion making her honest in a way daylight sometimes didn't. I used to dream about this, she admitted quietly. Not you exactly, just this. People who'd fight alongside me instead of leaving me to fight alone. I didn't let myself dream it too often, because wanting something that badly and not having it hurts worse than never wanting it at all. You don't have to ration your wanting anymore, Grace, Jonah said. Not with me. I'm starting to believe that, she said. Slowly. It's a hard habit to break after so many years of bracing for less. Then we'll break it together, Jonah said. Same as we did the fire and the fence and every other thing this valley threw at us. She laughed softly, tired and warm, and tucked herself closer against him, and Jonah thought, not for the first time, that he would gladly ride through every storm this valley could summon, if it meant ending up exactly here, exhausted and rain-soaked, and entirely certain, beside the woman who had saved everything he loved before he'd even known enough to love her back. The proposal itself, when it came 2 days later, wasn't grand or rehearsed. Jonah had planned something finer words practiced in his head while he worked the fence line, but when the moment arrived, it came instead in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Grace, standing at the newly mended north fence, checking the healing herd sunlight catching the gray, already threading through her dark hair, and Jonah found himself simply walking up beside her and saying what was already true. "Marry me, Grace Calloway." She turned startled flower, still dusting her apron from the morning's baking, and for a moment Jonah worried he'd gotten the moment all wrong. Too plain, too sudden, nothing like the words he'd practiced. Then she laughed, bright and unguarded, the sound Jonah had come to treasure more than almost anything else in this valley, and threw her arms around his neck before he'd even finished getting the words fully out. "Yes?" she said, against his shoulder, her voice thick with tears and laughter both at once. Yes, Jonah Wade, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her there at the fence line, the same fence Silas Vance's men had once cut in the dark, trying to destroy everything she'd built, and Jonah thought there was a particular kind of justice in that love taking root in exactly the place cruelty had once tried hardest to tear it down. Otis, watching from the porch with a grin that took 10 years off his weathered face, let out a whoop loud enough to startle the herd, and even from that distance Jonah could hear him already muttering something about finally getting to wear his good boots to a wedding before his knees gave out. That evening, as the three of them sat together on the porch, the ranch settled quiet and whole around them for the first time since Jonah had ridden home to a valley he'd expected to find nothing left in. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder and let out a long, contented breath. 2 years ago, she said, I sold everything I owned and rode into this valley believing I was paying off a debt I owed a stranger. I never once imagined I'd end up finding a home instead. Some debts, Jonah said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, turn out to be worth a great deal more than what was owed. Grace tilted her face up to look at him, and in her eyes, Jonah saw something that had been missing the very first morning he'd raised a rifle at her on this porch. Not just survival, not just quiet endurance against a world that had never made room for her, but something that looked unmistakably like belonging. I love you, Jonah Wade, she said, simple and certain, the same steady way she'd once told him exactly why a stranger's ranch had been worth saving. I love you too, Grace, Jonah said. More than I've got words for, and I expect I'll spend the rest of my life trying to find better ones anyway. The autumn evening settled gold and quiet over Wade Ranch, the herd grazing peaceful in the healed north pasture, the barn standing solid under a roof that had weathered fire and fraud, and every threat a desperate man could throw at it. And for the first time in longer than either of them could measure, Jonah and Grace sat together with nothing left to brace against, nothing left to fight. Only the wide, waiting shape of a future they had both against every cruel expectation this valley had ever placed on them, earned the right to build together. Word of the engagement moved through Millbrook Hollow faster than the church fire had, and within a week, half the valley seemed to have an opinion on when the wedding ought to happen, what should be served, and who deserved an invitation after 2 years of treating Grace like something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Folks are already asking after a date, Grace said one evening, setting down a fistful of notes passed along by well-meaning neighbors. Mrs. Pruitt wants to bring a cake. Reverend Coles asked twice already whether we'd consider having it in the new East Wing, seeing as half the county helped raise the timber. What do you want? Jonah asked. Grace considered the question longer than he expected. I want it simple, she said finally. I've had enough of this valley watching me from a careful distance to last a lifetime. I don't need a spectacle to prove anything to anybody anymore. I just want the people who actually stood beside us standing there when I say it out loud in front of God and everybody. Then that's what we'll have, Jonah said. The dress proved harder than either of them anticipated. Grace stood in front of the small mirror in her room 3 weeks before the wedding. Turning sideways, frowning at a gown, ordered from the Bozeman seamstress, that gathered wrong across her shoulders and pulled tight in ways that made her mouth press thin with old familiar disappointment. It's not right, she said quietly. When Jonah knocked and found her standing there more vulnerable in that moment than he'd seen her since the night before the hearing. "Then we'll find one that is," Jonah said. "That's not how it works, Jonah. Dresses are cut for a certain kind of body, and mine's never been that kind, and I've spent 30 years feeling like I'm wearing somebody else's shape and calling it mine." She smoothed the fabric down, frustration and old grief tangled together in the gesture. "I told myself I wasn't going to let this matter, that I'd wear whatever fit close enough and be grateful for the day itself. But standing here, I find I still want to feel beautiful in it, and I hate that some small part of me still doesn't believe that's possible." Jonah crossed the room and took both her hands, meeting her eyes in the mirror rather than turning her to face him. "I've watched you stare down a banker with a rifle at your back," he said. "Watched you carry a calf twice your weight through a storm without setting it down. Watched you stand in a courtroom and take apart a liar's testimony with nothing but plain questions and a steady voice. Grace Calloway, you have never once needed a dress to make you beautiful. You've been the most striking woman in every room you've walked into since the day you refused to lower your eyes at a man pointing a rifle at your chest." Grace's breath caught, and in the mirror, Jonah watched her expression shift, old doubt loosening its grip just slightly. "Mrs. Pruitt's cousin runs a proper dress shop in Helena," Grace said finally, a small surprised laugh breaking through. "Mrs. Pruitt offered to write ahead, get someone who actually knows how to cut for a figure like mine, instead of pretending my body is a problem to be solved." "Then let her write ahead," Jonah said. "And in the meantime, you ought to know, dress or no dress, I intend to marry you regardless. I'd marry you in that work apron you were wearing the first day I saw you, flower and all." Grace turned then finally and kissed him, soft and grateful, and whatever doubt had been sitting heavy in that room eased enough for both of them to laugh about it before the evening was through. The trial in December came and went faster than any of them expected, the evidence so thoroughly damning that Silas Vance's own lawyer reportedly advised him against contesting most of the charges. Sheriff Boone rode out the evening the verdict came down, hat in hand, a look on his face that told Jonah the news before he'd said a word. 20 years, Boone said. Territorial Judge didn't have much patience left for a man who tried to shoot his way out of a civil hearing on top of everything else. Arson alone would have bought him a decade. Add the rest, and he'll be an old man if he's anything at all by the time he sees open sky again. Grace absorbed the news quietly, and Jonah watched her search her own heart for some flicker of triumph or vindication, and find instead something calmer and more settled than either. "I thought I'd feel something bigger," she admitted. "Satisfaction, maybe. Instead, I just feel like a door's finally closed that's been standing open too long." "That's its own kind of peace," Jonah said. "It is," Grace agreed, and let the subject rest there, unwilling to give Silas Vance one more moment of her thoughts than absolutely required. Boone lingered a while longer than usual that evening, accepting a cup of coffee he didn't strictly need, and Jonah suspected the sheriff had more on his mind than the verdict alone. "You did right by this county, both of you," Boone said finally, turning his hat over in his hands. "I've worn this badge 11 years, and I let a man like Vance operate near enough in plain sight the whole time, telling myself I didn't have proof enough to move against him. Watching you two find that proof when I couldn't or wouldn't taught me something about the difference between waiting for certainty and simply doing the work." "You moved the moment we gave you cause to," Grace said. "That counts for more than you're giving yourself credit for, Sheriff." "Maybe," Boone said, standing to go. "I intend to move a good deal faster next time regardless. This valley's had enough of good people paying for other folks' caution." He tipped his hat to them both at the door. "Congratulations again on the wedding to come. This county could use a happy story to tell for a change." He rode off into the dusk, and Grace watched him go with something thoughtful in her expression. "He's a good man," she said. "Slow sometimes, but good." "Most good men are slow at least once in their life," Jonah said. "Questions only ever whether they catch up before the damage is done." There was one final unpleasant echo before the wedding, arriving in the shape of a lawyer from the territorial capital, sent he claimed on behalf of a distant cousin of Vance's, who believed the banker's remaining assets, including a small parcel of land bordering the Wade property, ought to pass to family, rather than be seized entirely by the territory. That parcel was purchased with funds fraudulently obtained from families across this county, Grace told the lawyer flatly when he came calling at the ranch, expecting an easy negotiation. I'd suggest your client take that concern up with the Territorial Banking Commission directly, since I have no authority over it, and even less patience for extending Silas Vance's family a courtesy. His own actions never extended to a single person in this valley. The lawyer left with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with, and Jonah, watching from the porch, felt a fierce, quiet pride swell in his chest at the sight of Grace closing that particular door as firmly as she'd closed every other one Vance had tried to leave cracked open behind him. He's not going to be the last person who tries to squeeze something out of what's left of that mess, Grace said, coming to sit beside Jonah once the lawyer's wagon had disappeared down the road. No, Jonah agreed. But you handled that one same as you handled every other. Like it wasn't even a question. It wasn't, Grace said simply. The wedding itself came on a clear, cold morning in early spring. The new east wing of the church finally finished its timber, still smelling faintly of fresh-cut pine, and Jonah stood at the front of a gathering that included nearly every soul in Millbrook Hollow, watching the doors for the woman who had walked into his life, pointing him toward coffee instead of running from a rifle. Otis stood beside him, as best man polished boots creaking with every shift of his weight, muttering under his breath about his knees holding up long enough to dance later, and Tommy Reese sat near the front, with a suit borrowed from Reverend Cole, grinning wide enough to split his face. When the doors opened and Grace stepped through in a dress that fit her exactly as it should cut, by hands that had understood her shape as something to be honored rather than apologized for, Jonah felt every careful word he'd practiced desert him entirely, leaving only the plain, staggering fact of her. She walked toward him, steady, unhurried, the same way she'd once walked toward a stranger holding a rifle, without a flicker of fear. And when she reached him, she took his hands like she'd been reaching for them her whole life without knowing his name. "You're staring," she murmured. "I intend to keep doing it for the next 50 years. Jonah murmured back, and Reverend Cole, standing before them, with his weathered face soft with something like joy, cleared his throat to begin. "We are gathered," the Reverend said, his voice carrying easy over the hushed, crowded room. "Not merely to witness a marriage, but to witness what this valley very nearly failed to recognize in time. That the measure of a person is never in how loudly the world judges them, but in how quietly and how faithfully they choose to do right, even when no one is watching, even when the cost is high, even when the reward seems impossibly far away." He looked between them, and something in his gaze carried the particular weight of a man who had bled for this exact moment, who had nearly died, protecting the truth that made it possible. Jonah Wade rode 2 years through wilderness believing there was nothing left worth returning to, Cole continued. Grace Calloway spent those same 2 years proving him wrong. One repaired fence, one paid debt, one act of quiet, stubborn faith at a time. Let their marriage stand as a reminder to this whole valley that kindness once given has a way of finding its way home, sometimes years later, sometimes disguised as a stranger standing on a porch, but always eventually home. Jonah spoke his vows plain and unrehearsed, the same way he'd proposed, because he'd learned by now that the truest things he had to say to Grace never needed polishing to land. "I nearly pointed a rifle at the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, and the gathered crowd laughed softly, warmly. The story of that first morning already worn smooth into valley legend. "I don't intend to spend the rest of my life making that particular mistake again. Grace Calloway, you saved everything I had left, before I even knew enough to be grateful for it. I mean to spend every day I've got left, making sure you never again have to fight for anything alone." Grace's vows, when she spoke them, were steadier than his, though her voice caught once right at the end. "I came to this valley believing I was paying off a debt," she said. "I told myself for 2 years that once it was settled, I'd have no more claim on this place, or the man I was saving it for. I was wrong about that, same as this whole valley was wrong about me for longer than I care to remember. Jonah Wade, you are not a debt. I'm settling. You're the home I didn't know I was still allowed to want." She squeezed his hands, tears finally slipping free. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that every single day." Reverend Cole pronounced them married to a swell of applause that rattled the new rafters, and Jonah kissed his wife in front of the entire valley that had once called her worthless, and felt in that single unguarded moment that every torch and every threat and every cruel whisper Silas Vance and his allies had thrown at them had finally completely burned itself out against something far stronger than any of them had understood. The celebration afterward spilled out across the churchyard and down toward the town square tables, groaning under more food than Millbrook Hollow had produced for a single gathering in years. And Otis, true to his word, danced with more enthusiasm than his knees strictly approved of spinning Mrs. Pruitt across the yard, until both of them were laughing too hard to keep proper rhythm. Partway through the evening, Otis climbed unsteadily onto an overturned crate, raising a glass with his good arm, while the crowd quieted around him. "Most of you know me as the old fool who kept this ranch's cattle fed while everybody figured Jonah Wade for dead and Miss Calloway for a lost cause." Otis said, his voice carrying rough and sincere over the gathered crowd. "I want it said plain in front of the whole valley that I've buried a lot of things in my time on this land. Good horses, old friends, more hope than I care to admit some winters. But I never once had to bury my faith in either one of these two, not for a single day, because they kept proving it right when the rest of this town was busy proving itself wrong." He raised his glass, higher eyes bright. "To Jonah and Grace Wade. May this valley never again make the mistake of underestimating a person before it's bothered to know their heart." The crowd roared its approval. Glasses raised high, and Grace pressed her face briefly into Jonah's shoulder, overcome before straightening to raise her own glass toward the old man who'd stood alone with a shotgun against 3 armed riders rather than let their home burn. Reverend Cole spoke next. Quieter, his words meant less for the crowd than for the two people standing at its center. "I've married a good many couples in my years behind that pulpit," he said. "I don't know that I've ever married two people who taught this whole congregation quite so much about what faith actually requires. Not the easy kind recited on a Sunday, the kind that costs something. The kind Grace Calloway paid for 2 years running alone before any of us thought to ask if she needed help." Mrs. Pruitt, standing near the edge of the gathering with her husband's hand in hers, called out through the crowd's murmur of agreement. "And the kind Ezra should have offered a great deal sooner than he did," which drew a wave of laughter and a rueful, good-natured nod from Ezra Pruitt himself. No longer a man hiding behind old cowardice, but one willing finally to be teased for having outgrown it. The dancing carried on well past dark lanterns strung between the church and the newly repaired fence posts, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Jonah pulled Grace away from the noise for a quiet moment at the edge of the gathering, just the two of them, the music and laughter carrying on warm behind them. "Regretting the simple wedding yet?" Jonah asked, only half joking, watching half the county still dancing. "Not for a moment," Grace said. "Simple was never about small Jonah. It was about only having the people here who actually mattered. Turns out that's most of the valley once you strip away the ones who never deserved a place in it to begin with." "I'd say that's a fair trade," Jonah said, and kissed her again. Slower this time. Unhurried, a man with nowhere left to be, but exactly where he was. Years gathered gently after that, the way they do for people who have finally stopped bracing against the next disaster and started simply living. The ranch grew steadily under Grace's careful management and Jonah's steady hand, the herd doubling. Within 3 years, the barn Grace had once rebuilt alone, now standing at the center of a spread that had become by any measure the finest working ranch in the valley. Tommy Reese grew from an awkward, grateful boy into a foreman. Jonah trusted with entire seasons of decisions, and the day he came to ask Jonah's blessing to court the schoolteacher from the next county over, he stood in the kitchen wringing his hat exactly the way Ezra Pruitt once had, though for entirely different reasons. "I know what I was when I came here," Tommy said. "Figured you ought to hear it from me plain in case it matters to her family that I was once caught stealing your cattle." "What matters," Jonah said, "is what you've been every day since. Man's not measured by his worst mistake, Tommy. You taught me that lesson yourself standing up in that courtroom when plenty of grown men in this county wouldn't have had the nerve." Tommy built his own small house eventually on land. Jonah gifted him outright, unwilling to let the boy who'd once stood shackled in a courtroom spend his whole life renting a place to belong. And when his first child was born, he rode out to the main house at first light to ask, hesitant and hopeful, whether Grace would stand as the baby's godmother. "Only if you promise not to raise her to cut fences in the dark," Grace said. And Tommy laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch step. And Jonah thought, watching them, that there was no sweeter proof of a man's redemption than the ease with which the people he'd once wronged could finally laugh alongside him. Otis lived long enough to see 2 grandchildren of the heart, Jonah and Grace's own children, born 18 months apart. Both of them dark-haired and stubborn in ways that made Grace laugh and shake her head and say the Lord had a sense of humor, giving her 2 more of exactly what she'd married into. The old man taught both children to ride before they could properly walk, propping the smallest one in front of him in the saddle, with a patience Jonah had rarely seen him show anything but the herd. "You spoil them worse than you ever spoiled that mare," Grace told him once, watching Otis let their daughter feed the horses twice her allotted share of oats. "Man's entitled to spoil what he loves," Otis said, unbothered, "especially once he's old enough to know how short the time for it really is." He said it lightly, the way he said most things, but Jonah caught something underneath the words that settled heavy in his chest. And sure enough, not 2 winters later, Otis passed peaceful in his sleep, in the same small room he'd occupied for over a decade. The whole valley turned out for his funeral, because by then, everyone in Millbrook Hollow understood exactly what kind of loyalty that old man had given a family that wasn't his, by blood, only by choice, which Grace always said counted for a great deal more anyway. He held this ranch together with nothing but stubbornness for 2 years before either of us knew what we were building, Grace said at the graveside, her voice steady even as her eyes weren't. I don't know that Jonah or I would have anything at all to show for our lives if Otis hadn't decided all those years ago that an old ranch hand with nowhere else to go was going to make himself useful to a widow nobody else believed in. Mrs. Pruitt and Grace became against every early expectation. Either of them might have voiced close friends, the 2 of them running the town's small relief fund together, for widows and struggling families. The same kind of help neither of them had received when they'd needed it. Most offered now freely to anyone the valley might otherwise have let fall through the cracks. Silas Vance served his full sentence in the territorial prison, and when he was finally released, an old and broken man with no fortune left, and no valley willing to have him back. He settled somewhere far to the east, where no one knew his name or his history. And Millbrook Hollow, true to Grace's word, spent very little time thinking of him again. It was a cold morning, nearly a decade after Jonah had first ridden home, their son already tall enough to help with chores and their daughter chasing chickens across the yard, when a wagon rolled slow up the long dirt road, driven by a thin young woman with tired eyes and 2 small children huddled behind her against the morning chill. Grace was the one who walked out to meet her the way she always did when a stranger's wagon came up that road uncertain, and Jonah watched from the porch as the young woman explained, halting and ashamed, that her husband had died the previous spring, that the bank in the next county had already taken the house, that she'd heard from more than one person along the road that the Wade Ranch was a place where a person down on their luck might find honest work and a fair hand instead of judgment. "They said you'd understand," the woman said, twisting her hands the same anxious way Grace herself once had, on account of what happened to you years back. Grace looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and Jonah saw something pass across his wife's face. Old memory and present purpose meeting in the same breath. "Everyone deserves a chance to rebuild," Grace said, and reached out to take the woman's hands, steady and sure, the same way a stranger had once told her the very same thing at an auction she'd believed would be the end of everything she had left. "Come inside. We'll find you somewhere warm, and we'll talk about what comes next." Jonah watched his wife lead the young widow and her children up the porch steps into the same kitchen where he'd once pointed a rifle at a stranger who refused to be afraid of him, and felt the whole shape of their story settle finally and completely into something larger than either of them had ever intended it to be. And Jonah Wade, who had once ridden home through 2 years of wilderness believing there was nothing left in this valley worth returning to, spent every evening of the rest of his life on the porch of a ranch that had very nearly been lost. watching his wife move through the home she'd rebuilt with her own two hands, and understood more clearly with every passing year that the greatest fortune he'd ever found in that valley wasn't the land or the cattle or even the ranch itself. It was the quiet, unbreakable woman who had refused to let a stranger's kindness go unanswered, who had stood alone against a world that told her she wasn't worth the fight, and who had proven beyond any doubt this valley would ever again dare to raise that. The truest measure of a person's worth was never found in how the world first saw them, but in what they built when no one believed they could. Grace Calloway. Wade had come to Millbrook Hollow to pay a debt she believed she owed a stranger. She left behind instead a legacy the entire valley would spend generations trying to live up to. And that more than any fortune, any title, any grudging apology wrung from a town too slow to see her worth was the truest kind of homecoming either of them would ever need.